Morning, everybody, and welcome to this year's Climate Summit, following the success of last year's pre-COP Summit and the good feedback I got from it. I decided to do this every year, so I'm very much looking forward to this morning's session. You won't be hearing a lot from me, same as last year. I think it's important we hear from all the people I've got coming to speak, so you'll just get an intro and a conclusion from me, but I will compare the questions. And on that point, if you have questions for any of the panelists as we go through the morning, please put them in the Q&A and not in the chat. I won't be reading the chat, but I will be reading the Q&A. As I think most of you know, tackling climate change is a very important issue for me, as I know it is for many of you. And in addition to my work with Conservative Environment Network, the two big things I've been working most on in the past year on this topic are, firstly, in my role as lead sponsor of the local electricity bill here, where we have now over 300 MPs of the 650 who are supporting this. And I've been trying to get this into a place where it can become government policy one way or the other. And that would enable the small scale generators of renewable energy in our villages, in our towns, to more easily be able to sell that to the local community, which is very difficult for them to do at the moment. The other thing I've been working a lot on, trying to get ministers to agree to, and both these things I'm having very good conversations with them about. But the other thing is to try and get our houses, and obviously we've had a lot of new houses built in this area, have our new houses built to the latest environmental standard rather than the one at the time that they got planning permission, once a certain time has elapsed. Because at the moment what happens is, a house might have been given permission 5 or 6 years ago. The government has introduced new environmental standards, but because the permission wasn't given in that year, it was given several years ago, they're allowed to build to a standard that we know we're going to have to retrofit. So on both the local electricity bill and on the environmental standards of new homes, I've been having a lot of very positive conversations with ministers, and I hope there will be some good news to report in the coming months. Now, we're meeting and having this summit at a time of lots of challenges. It comes after COP26, and I'm delighted that we'll have Alok Sharma here in a little while to talk to everybody about what's happened in the aftermath of COP26. But there are two particular challenges which are on my mind, as I'm sure they're on your mind. One is posed by the war in Ukraine and relates to our sources of energy. So we have been making great progress as a country in phasing out the use of coal, in increasing the use of renewables. But the war in Ukraine has definitely posed the UK, and not just the UK, countries around the world, an important challenge about where their energy supply comes from and how we can ensure that Putin is not rewarded for the action he is taking and the control of his gas supply, whilst staying on course with our net zero goal. The second big challenge that's on my mind, which, as those of you who heard me talk about this before know, is always on my mind, but I think has been drawn into focus with the cost of living, is that too often, as I say, the voices of the environmental movement are typically affluent, white, home-owning, middle-aged, often with secure pensions, secure jobs, and the things they call for do not take account of people who are on lower incomes. And as someone who spent his pre-politics career working with children and families on low incomes, it's particularly important to me that the things we call for, the things we change, take account of the fact that people have very different financial means. And in this cost of living challenge we've got at the moment, we can see very clearly that some people can make certain changes and others can't. And I think that's a good reminder to us all that we have to find ways of bringing everybody together and taking them with us, rather than just thinking about those who have the greatest financial means at the moment who can make those changes. Other people might well want to make those changes, if they were able to do so. So those are two things that I hope we'll talk about through the course of today, during the day. But now we're going to go on to a session about renewables. This is topical at any time, but particularly at the moment. And we've got three great speakers here from Ørsted, Chatham House, and the Conservative Environment Network. They're each going to be talking about slightly different things, so wind, solar, and bioenergy, and then we can have a broader discussion about the role of renewables and those which are not covered by the three speakers. As ever, questions in the Q&A, not in the chat, and only questions for this session. So I'm not going to see questions for Alok Sharma until we get to the Alok Sharma session. And the questions for me, feel free to email me afterwards, but I'm listening to the presentations. I'm not going to be answering questions whilst those are going on. So I'm very pleased to welcome the three speakers here today. And I think we will kick off with Richard. If he can take his camera off and unmute. There he is. Richard works for Ørsted, and he's going to kick us off with a discussion about the role of wind. So thanks very much for being here, Richard. Over to you.
Thank you. Good morning, David, and good morning, everyone. That's quite a hard act to follow after those primary schools, so I will do my best. For those of you, I've got a couple of slides, but I think I'm just going to chat, actually. I might just put a couple of slides up later, but I think it's easier just to speak. So for those of you who don't know who Ørsted are, we're the sort of world's largest offshore wind developer, in that's around the world and in the UK as well. And to put that into perspective, we're probably generating about over 7% of the UK's electricity already. As of today, and we're probably invested about 14-15 billion pounds in the UK in the last decade, and we'll invest that much again. So that's the kind of scale that we're talking about. I just sort of wanted to think about where are we now in terms of wind and offshore wind and onshore wind, and where are we going to be in 10-20 years time, and also to spend a couple of minutes talking about the advantages and the challenges from onshore and offshore wind as well, and be really interested to hear people's perspectives who are joining us today as well. And I'm finally going to just finish right at the very end talking about that word that everyone's talking about at the moment, that's hydrogen, and how that links in with offshore and onshore wind. But I'm going to share just one very quick draft at the moment, just to put this into perspective, and I hope this works. Please shout, those watching, if it doesn't. Tell me if you can see this, or whether you can if you can see the slide properly, please.
Yeah, we can see that.
That's great. So this here, and I'm going to, if you can see me moving on the screen, you're not. If you start around 2020, this is what we're generating at the moment. So that big dark green, that's offshore wind. There's a little bit of onshore wind above it in the lighter green. And below it, there's a little bit of some other renewables as well. And that big grey graph is the gas and the coal, which is about to disappear in the next 5 years, almost completely. And then if you skip ahead about halfway across the graph, that's 2030, and then you see what it looks like then. This is what we're going to be generating in the UK. That's onshore wind is the big dark green splurge now, and there's some onshore wind above it, which is still quite significant. And I know others are following that afterwards, and you're seeing more solar come on the system then as well. And what you've seen underneath is almost no coal and gas, probably no coal whatsoever, and a tiny bit of gas on the system at that point. And in fact, if you then disappear across all the way to 2050, and then you see how much of our electricity is going to be coming from various renewables, including onshore wind, offshore wind, solar, and other factors. And what you'll also see in that graph is just how much more electricity we're producing. So if the unit they use is terawatt hour. So if we're producing 300 terawatt hours, 300 units of electricity in the UK every year now, that's going to jump to more than double that. And that's going to be to take into account all the electricity we need for electric cars, for electric heating in homes, and other factors. And I will stop sharing now. So that's what we're talking about. That's the kind of scale of what needs to happen. And please let me know. Hopefully I'm now just back on screen. And excuse me, I'm not used to on
Yes, you are.
on Zoom. Yep, that's great. So that's what's going to happen. And what does that mean for communities, for us, for the UK, up and down the country? So I think the first thing I'm going to talk about is it's going to be more offshore wind. It's going to be a lot more. A lot of that obviously is literally out of sight. What we're building at the moment is, say, 50, 100 kilometers offshore. Where we do see that impacting on people onshore at the moment is we are going to need to have more corridors coming through the onshore land to get to the substation, and that's going to disrupt some people. And we are also going to see obviously more grid being built all around the country to develop this. At the moment, all our grid infrastructure is focused around the coal and the gas fields around the country. That's where we put the substations. That's where that made sense at the time. And now we're going to have to shift where that is to where we're producing electricity in the next 50 years, which is mainly coming offshore. And I think if you look at onshore as well, what does that mean? So it's going to be more onshore wind being developed. I think it's a good option. I think it's an excellent option, and it's going to be how comfortable are people having more onshore wind developed? How comfortable are they having it closer to their community? I know I speak to lots of people up and down the country. Some people really like them, some people really hate them, some people are happy where they are and want more. Some people are worried that we're just absolutely inundating the countryside with these technologies, and that's a question we're all going to have to face if we want to have this transition to net zero. And I think the one question we don't have to have anymore as a challenge is cost, because these technologies 10 years ago were really expensive, and they were beginning to put money on people's bills. What you've seen now is the cost has come down so much that when we build new offshore wind farms, new onshore wind farms, it's cheaper than building any new gas or coal or nuclear. And also what you're seeing is at the moment, these new onshore wind farms and offshore wind farms, the mechanism the government used, they'll be paying money back to the government at the current rate. They're going to get a guaranteed return, and at the moment their guaranteed return is so low that at current wholesale prices we pay money back to the government to make up for the how high prices are. And also when you look at the prices at the moment, the wholesale prices that are in the press everywhere, all of these technologies are cheaper. So none of this is an instant fix to what we're going through at the moment, and I know people are going through a lot of pain with their energy bills, but in every single year, if we have more and more renewables on the grid, you'll see that electricity price that we pay become cheaper and cheaper. Like again, I'm going to repeat, this is not an instant fix. This is not going to solve everything in the next 12 months and 2 years, but in 5 years, 10 years time, we're no longer going to be paying electricity based on the gas price, whether that's high or low, and any security crunches that come from whether it's Russia or anywhere else in the world won't be affecting us anymore. It's all going to be much more homegrown electricity. And the final idea I wanted to touch on, because I just wanted to keep it short and hopefully people will have time to answer questions, is then what's the next stage for us? We know how to build onshore wind, we know how to build offshore wind. It's how do we link with hydrogen? How do we use some of that electricity we produce to transform water into hydrogen and oxygen? And we use the hydrogen, we use it in energy intensive industries like refining, like steel production, like kind of process industries. And also we can store it and use it in the long term. We'll use it in those periods in winter when we have very high demand and the wind's not blowing, the sun's not shining, and people always say, what's the answer to that problem? Well, the answer at the moment is you burn gas, and that's fine. That's, we're not have to be at net zero yet, but in the long term, what you're going to do is store hydrogen or store electricity in another means in large batteries, and then you're going to use that electricity there. I think that's a big overview. I'm sure people have lots of different questions, so I'm going to pass over to my fellow presenters now, and happy to take questions afterwards.
Thank you very much, Richard. Good way to kick us off, and I can see lots of questions coming in. Now I'm going to go to Jack, who's Senior Climate Program Manager at the Conservative Environment Network. I'm grateful to Jack because he's a late stand-in. We had a different solar speaker who had to pull out late last week, so I'm very grateful for Jack stepping in at short notice to talk to us about solar. Jack, over to you.
Hi, yeah, no, thanks very much for having me. It's a pleasure. So by way of introduction, I'm on the climate team for the Conservative Environment Network. Most of our work is done for our parliamentary caucus, which David is an excellent member of. So about 125 Conservative backbenchers who sort of want to promote the sort of decarbonisation and conservation agendas. I thought, because unlike Daniel and Richard, I'm not quite a solar expert per se, but I thought I'd speak more to the general politics around solar energy and sort of the more macro view rather than getting into hardcore specifics of the technology, and especially because it's Monday morning, it might be a bit much. So for a start, I think the overall thing to keep in mind here is that we're aiming to have a decarbonised power grid by 2035, and also in that same year we're aiming to have a 78% reduction on our carbon emissions compared to what we had in 1990, and this is on the way to a net zero economy by 2050. So the CCC's, the Climate Change Committee's pathway, has wind and solar together providing between 75 and 90% of electricity in 2050. So that includes about 85 gigawatts of solar power capacity, with nuclear and gas with carbon capture making up the remainder, for example. That might change now because the government's had its energy security strategy, which had a lot of nuclear power in it, but still we're going to need a lot of solar, basically. So there's two broad approaches with solar. There's the solar that goes on your rooftop, and there's the solar farms, like the big ones. So with rooftop, obviously it goes on buildings. It needs less space because it's on top of a building rather than just on land, but it is more expensive. And then utility uses up land, but it's much cheaper. It's the cheapest source of electricity that we have. And the good news is that in order to get to the targets we have for 2050, we need less land than is currently taken up by golf courses. So it's really not that much. It's 0.6% of land. So there's some advantages to land and rooftop. So rooftop, some people are getting like basically negative bills already because they've got a solar panel and battery storage. And then on land, it can help farmers diversify their income, so they can make a lot of money from it, and it'll help support their businesses. Ultimately, as well, there's sort of philosophical questions over whether or not a government could tell a farmer what to do with his land, for people who are concerned about land being taken up. But that is a very important point as well, is that in general, you don't want high productive, good quality land being taken out of food production for solar farms, but there's already a presumption in the planning system against that, although I think the Environment Secretary said on Thursday or Wednesday that the government's looking at strengthening it that bit more, so we kind of avoid inappropriate big solar farms that are taking good quality land out of production. The other advantages that I'll go through very quickly is that it's really low maintenance, it's very low cost, like I said. It can be very good for biodiversity because the bugs and animals can go and graze under it and everything like that. And also it can be used, so agrivoltaic technology can be used, so you can grow grass underneath solar panels, and then animals can go and graze under it. So that sort of brings the agricultural interest and the solar farm interest together. Another quick thing to mention is that solar doesn't come alone, so we kind of need a lot of batteries to come alongside solar for when it's nighttime or when the sun isn't shining. But the good news on that is that the battery industry is really ramping up now. I was just listening to an interview on Times Radio earlier where they're getting loads, and not quite breaking even yet because it's still a new industry, but it's certainly growing very, very fast. And I think, yeah, so as I was talking about food security, on the wrong way around my notes. As I was talking about food security, I think that brings me on to the wider geopolitical context, which I feel like I should mention as well. So Putin's invasion of Ukraine has sort of woken Europe up, including us, to our dependence on Russian gas, in particular for power production. The UK doesn't actually import that much Russian oil and gas ourselves, and we're looking to phase it out by the end of the year, which is really great. But Russia still definitely sets the price of gas in the European market, which is the price that we have to pay ultimately, because we're dependent upon the European market, both for our own gas and also to sell to the Europeans. And that means that because we're getting rid of the Russian gas, and so is Europe, we're bringing in more American and Middle Eastern liquefied natural gas. But the problem here is that basically the more international the market, the more volatile and competitive the market is. So we'll be competing with China for liquefied natural gas from the Middle East, for example. And that means that ultimately will be more vulnerable to shocks and supply chain shocks in the future and more volatile bills. I think that's why the government has really put the emphasis on renewables being part of the energy security strategy, because we can build them here and we can bring bills back under control. Basically, it's just good for climate change as well. So it's sort of meeting all three of the energy policy triangle, which is security, sustainability, and affordability. Some people do say that we could just pump more oil and gas ourselves, but this isn't really an economic way out of the situation, because the North Sea oil and gas assets are already being sweated, quite rightly. And while it might make sense to bring a couple more fields online to tie us over, ultimately there just isn't that much oil and gas left in the North Sea, and it's quite expensive to extract. So it's a declining mature basin. And then there's also been discussions around fracking, but I think that's a bit of a red herring. We sort of saw in the mid-2010s that it doesn't really work, and it certainly wouldn't bring down prices. So I think as Richard was saying, the affordability of renewables means that they're basically the only sensible way forward, along with cleaner sources of power like nuclear and hydrogen and carbon captured gas. But this is why I was going to talk about geopolitics. There's no doubt that there are some geopolitical challenges about switching to more solar. So China makes up something like 75% of the supply chain in solar power, because they just build all the panels basically. And there's people who are particularly worried about the human rights abuses in Xinjiang, where the Uyghur Muslims live, and that's where a lot of solar power capacity comes from. However, the good news is that unlike with fossil fuels, where it all just comes from Russia or Saudi Arabia or countries which you might not want to be reliant upon for your energy, the stuff that goes into solar panels can basically be found all over the world, whether that's in Australia, Argentina, particularly big countries, for example. So I think rather than being worried about how reliant we are on China to make our solar panels, we can just switch up our partners and sort of let the market find new ways of finding more sustainable and better sources of our solar power capacity, for example. So yeah, I thought I'll leave it there. Overall, I think the takeaway is that solar is renewable, which makes it good for the planet. We can build it here, or we can install it here, which makes it good for our energy security, and it's the cheapest source of power available, which is good for our wallets, especially at the moment. And while there are some challenges, both political and economic, they can certainly be overcome. And like I said earlier, I was going to go into all the troubles with the grid and how we have to radically upgrade the grid so it's ready for wind and solar. But as it's Monday and I'm already probably going over time, I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jack. The questions are flooding in. I will try and get through as many as I can, but once we've heard from Daniel, and Daniel's going to be talking to us about bioenergy, and then there's going to be lots and lots of questions for the three of you. So Daniel, welcome, and over to you.
Thanks very much, David. Yeah, so my name is Dr. Daniel Quiggin. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at Chatham House. I was asked today to speak about the prospects for renewable energy and specifically bioenergy and how realistic it is to transition to them in the near future. I suppose my answer to the question is yes, it's possible and realistic, and indeed the energy transition is already underway. However, bioenergy, as I'll speak about in a little bit, is perhaps more limited than is currently being imagined. However, I'd like to step back to begin with and present arguments as to why it's critical the energy transition significantly accelerates, and indeed why it may accelerate in the near future. So to do this, I'm going to touch upon the growing emissions gap, climate risks, and how climate impact models are currently underrepresenting potential near-term impacts. The potential risks of relying on future negative emission technologies, this is the bioenergy bit essentially, and how they could create significant food price inflation on top of current and climate-induced inflationary pressures in the food sector, and how therefore, as climate impacts increasing the impact on society, the electorate will likely demand an accelerated energy transition. So just very quickly, historically, global society hasn't acted swiftly enough to put us on a 1.5 or even a 2 degree pathway. meaning the emissions gap towards a pathway preventing runaway climate change. And I do think it's important to remember that after 2 degrees worth of warming, runaway climate change is a real risk. It's important to also remember that feedback mechanisms beyond 2 degrees would have disastrous and very uncontrollable consequences. So based on COP26 pledges, the current emissions gap between countries' current pledges and a non-overshoot, and I'll just emphasize that word non-overshoot, and I'll come back to it in a minute, a non-overshoot pathway would require the equivalent of 2 years of the remaining 2020s to be zero emissions globally. Or to put that in other words, we would need slightly more than 25% of the 2020s to have near zero economic activity. This is clearly politically unachievable, but does put the scale of the challenge into perspective. It's important, as I sort of already have highlighted, to interrogate what I mean by a non-overshoot pathway. In essence, current emissions are around about 36 billion tonnes of CO2 per year, and the remaining carbon budget is around about 400 billion tonnes for a 66% of achieving 1.5 degrees worth of warming. No overshoot means remaining within this carbon budget without relying on speculative technologies which may remove CO2 from the atmosphere. And given this carbon budget needs to be therefore spread out over the remaining decades until 2100, if emission continues at current levels, this carbon budget could be completely expended by the end of the 2020s, hence the need to have an equivalent of 2 years worth of near zero emissions before 2030. Stepping back from carbon budgets, let's quickly ask ourselves what the risks and impacts are that we're trying to avoid. So I recently led a climate change risk assessment report for Chatham House in the run-up to COP26, commissioned by the FCDO, and indeed cited by Alok Sharma in many of his speeches around COP26. Risk can be classified into direct, indirect, and systemic or cascading risks. It's the direct risks that most climate impact models can provide a degree of quantitative certainty about. And I'll just give you a couple of heatwave focused examples. So globally, we're already seeing more than 50% of the COVID-19 lost working hours that we experienced in 2020 already being lost every year to heat waves impacting labour productivity. And by 2040, 3.9 billion people will be exposed to major heat waves. And by the 2030s, so even sooner in time, 400 million people will be unable to work outside. And very sadly, around 10 million people are likely to die due to heat waves every year. Indeed, the direct impacts of climate change within the domains of flooding, agriculture, and food, storms and drought are just as scary, but I won't mention them here because we just don't have enough time. What I find even more scary is the cascading risks, which are nearly impossible to quantify due to the number of variables. However, many of these cascading risks stem from how changing weather patterns force both people and ecosystems to shift their geographies and result in both agricultural yields decreasing and hence greater food insecurity, and how pests and their associated diseases then interact with populations in new ways, leading to emerging infectious diseases and vector-borne diseases. So many of the direct impacts, which will likely lead to massive food insecurity and the displacement of people, will be amplified by epidemics and pandemics caused by complex cascading impacts of climate change. And current climate impact models indicate that many of the quantifiable direct risks will be occurring over the next couple of decades. When you combine these near-term climate risks alongside the scale of emissions gap that I previously mentioned on the mitigation side, then you realize that many of the climate models that drive the impact models are likely to be heavily underestimating the risks, and things start to look truly scary. Briefly on this underestimation of the climate models, there are two meta-level concerns. Firstly, many of the current climate models don't fully account for what are termed tipping points and feedback mechanisms within the Earth's climate system. A simple example of this tipping point and feedback mechanism is the albedo effect from snow reflecting heat from the poles of the Earth. As snow and ice melt, the Earth retains more of the sun's heat, just in the same way that a black surface will heat up quicker than a white one. So as snow and ice at the poles melt, the warming of the Earth accelerates faster than before. Within climate models, the rate at which the ice shelf melts due to ocean currents warming isn't well understood. Therefore, its quantification in models, climate models, is performed in a conservative manner. But much of the current emerging and current science indicates these dynamics are occurring much more quickly than the models account for. There are many of these tipping points and feedback mechanisms in the Earth's climate system, many of which are modelled in this conservative manner. So I think from this, we can see that many of the impacts of climate change could well be happening sooner in time and with greater severity. Further, our climate models were designed to run on the supercomputers of the past. And while supercomputing power is staggering, the physics of climate change and the sheer size of the Earth means the geographic granularity of their predictions are really quite coarse. The computers of today could enable scientists to provide much more granular predictions. So why is this of concern? Because we've seen in many of the extreme weather events of the last 2 to 3 years have vastly exceeded what current climate models predict, and that these have been on geographic scales much smaller than even the most geographically granular models we currently have, due to the fact that models were designed for supercomputers of the past. Finally, and I'm not going to hugely go into this, but our ability to prevent the impacts of climate change via adaptation is very much limited. Many of the impacts of climate change will go way beyond what we can adapt to. So if we combine all of these concerns, clearly the imperative to act swiftly is not just growing, but staring us in the face. And conveniently, many of the decarbonisation solutions we have are proven, cheap, and align with reducing our exposure to global energy markets, and hence it's currently there is a growing alignment between energy security and climate change mitigation or minimization. So what may I hear you ask, why may I hear you ask, do we consistently hear much more positive noises in relation to net zero? Net zero in many ways buys us time because the no overshoot condition of the carbon budget is relaxed, allowing us in theory to emit more CO2 in the atmosphere beyond the 400 billion tonne carbon budget I previously mentioned. Net zero allows for the CO2 to be sucked out of the atmosphere in the future, compensating for overshooting the 400 billion by netting it off with future negative emissions. The problem here is that many of the engineered negative emissions are yet to be proven commercially at scale. In a moment, I'll briefly detail some of those issues, but at a meta level, their unproven, unscaled nature means that we're starting to bet really big, risking complete climate catastrophe if they underdeliver in the future. It is for this reason that there are a growing number of experts and civil society groups calling for net zero to be separated out between CO2 reductions via traditional renewables, such as solar, and the more speculative atmospheric CO2 removals via negative emission technologies. Presently, there is no separation, and as such, in theory, under net zero, emissions could grow over time, and we therefore increasingly rely more and more and more on removing CO2 from the atmosphere. Hence, the risks of reliance on negative emissions grow. So very briefly, and David, I'll just sort of comfort you here by saying I'm probably going to speak for another minute or two. So what are the issues with negative emission technology? The two main technologies are direct air capture, or DAC, and bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. So this is the bioenergy bit. And so this is abbreviated to BECCS. They both have similar issues. The first and second law of thermodynamics tells us that separating a diffuse gas from a diffuse gas is incredibly energy intensive. Namely, separating CO2 out of the air will require lots of energy. DAC does this by using electricity and heat to literally vacuum up the air and capture the CO2. BECCS works by utilizing the photosynthetic process in plants and trees, meaning plants and trees absorb CO2 as they grow. So by burning them and capturing their CO2 and replanting the trees or plants, you create negative emissions if you can store that CO2 underground in vast volumes. BECCS is seen as the technology with the greatest potential. However, the heat required to capture in the capture process is likely to mean that BECCS is very expensive, and the biomass or bioenergy supply chains required will lead to significant emissions, partially undermining the net negativity of BECCS that BECCS is trying to deliver. There are many other issues with BECCS and with that bioenergy, but just to focus on the most important one, that's around land and land competition with food production. So just to put this in scale terms, the recent IPCC report, essentially the average pathway predicts or forecasts 2.75 gigatons of CO2 removal via BECCS will be needed in 2050. If this all comes from forests, that would require around about 27% of all forest land globally. And if this was to come from the agricultural sector by growing plants, this would be equivalent to around 2.5 of the global agricultural land area. Doesn't sound like too much, but if we concentrated that all in the EU, that would be 75% of the EU's agricultural land area. So that we can see, by relying on bioenergy in the context of BECCS and net zero, we're likely to lead to increasing food insecurity at a time when food security is already increasing. A greater realization of these scaling issues and associated externalities, both for BECCS and DAC, alongside their likely high cost and traditional decarbonisation deterrence hazard they are likely to represent, is leading to a greater realization that if we were to appropriately step up to the risks of climate change, we must move faster now, relying less on unproven and future risky technologies, and combined with the need to move away from reliance on international energy markets due to the current global energy security crisis, I see no alternative other than to accelerate the deployment of the types of renewables that Richard just spoke about. It is only through these technologies that are proven and cheap now, such as wind and solar, that we should be relying on to deliver a future with an outside chance of averting runaway climate change. I was going to mention the demand side, but maybe we can pick this up in the Q&A. But I was really pleasantly surprised to see the school children mention reducing our consumption of all sorts of energy intensive goods and services. I'll leave it there. I realise I ran over time a little bit.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I have got about 25 questions here to try and fit into 13 minutes, which is not going to be possible. So I'm going to try and do them as quickly as I can. But if you can, if Jack, Richard, Daniel, if you can provide short answers and not necessarily answer every one, then that would be very helpful. There were a couple about your graph, Richard, which feel free to touch on briefly, but I don't want to dwell on those. I'll probably send those to you afterwards. And apologies, I probably won't do your poll questions so that I can get through as many of these as possible in the order in which they came. So I'm going to do groups of three, and you guys tell me what you want to answer briefly. So Heather, how are we going to store energy to manage energy demand? Luke, no, that's a graph question. Lois or Louis, what reserve capacity do we need to compensate for the intermittent nature of wind and solar? And Kath, why is there so little conversation about wave energy? We're an island with enormous possibilities there. So raise our hand either physically or otherwise. Otherwise, I'll pick someone. Richard, go for it.
Just very quickly, I'll answer wave first. We're still trying to do wave energy. At the moment, it is still proving to be very expensive. 15 years ago, solar, wind, wave were all kind of at the same point. For various reasons, it's turned out that solar and wind are cheaper and produce more energy, and we've not managed to crack how to do wave at grand scale yet. So that's what's going on. But I still speak to people who are still trying to do wave technology. They're still trying to move it on. How do we store energy? Number of different ways. At the moment, the easiest way actually is still pumping water up a hill and running it down to a turbine. And I know that sounds quite basic, but it is actually quite effective. Battery storage is coming on in leaps and bounds there, working out how to do things called flywheels and heat storage. There's lots of different options. And the short answer to how much reserve capacity do we need, I don't think we really know yet. And that's okay. We don't have to have all the answers to everything in the next, for how the world looks like in 25 years' time right now. We just need to keep plugging away at all those different technologies, and one of them or a combination of them will prove to be the best combination in terms of cost and how much space and how effective they are.
I'll take one other person, Jack or Daniel, and then I will give the other one the next three questions. Jack, go for it.
Yeah, I might just add, so I think I remember finding out recently that the potential tidal, or like the sort of best marine type of energy, in my opinion, is only 11 gigawatts potential. So it's not actually that much that we can do, despite the fact being an island, because it's sort of all on one side of the UK. And as Richard said, it is still quite expensive. And then also to add to the storage things, as well as batteries, hydrogen, and pumping up and down a hill, there's also demand side response. So there's a piece in the Times, I think, today, and it sounds quite gloom and doom, saying like customers are going to be paid to switch off using their washing machines at peak time, for example. Some people might take that as like energy rationing, but actually this is just like modernizing the grid, so flattening out demand. So for example, in 2035, you might be paid to charge up your EV, or at least you'll be able to charge up your EV when fuel is a lot cheaper at home, if you charge it at 4 o'clock in the morning when there's a lot of wind online. So there's also demand side response as well as storage.
Thank you very much. Right, Daniel, we'll put the next group to you first. There was a question from David here about the relative merits of hydrogen and batteries for energy storage, which I think has been touched on. Feel free to say anything more that you would like about that. But the next three questions otherwise are, Richard, do we need to reform our energy pricing regime? Why, for example, are energy prices tied to gas when a large proportion of our energy is coming from renewables? Mark asks, why has it taken the UK so long to invest in wind power? Denmark has had loads of wind turbines. Denmark had loads of wind turbines 30 years ago. And Luke asks, why is the government allowing new North Sea oil and gas licenses that won't kick in for years if wind energy, and presumably others, is ramping up so quickly? So Daniel, do you want to start with those?
Sure, and I'll be quick. So I think on the hydrogen side, I do think that green hydrogen is incredibly really exciting, actually, and the main reason, because you can actually create seasonal storage, whereas with battery storage you tend to put the power in and take it out quite quickly, and therefore it's very difficult to create that seasonal storage between summer and winter, which is really important. And electrolyzers are massively falling in cost, so green hydrogen offers a really great prospect. I would warn against blue hydrogen. I'm not a big fan of CCS. I think CCS is going to be incredibly expensive. I think a lot of the R&D behind it is hidden behind commercial confidentiality at the moment. And where you can pick behind that commercial confidentiality, we see that the energy input to CCS is actually incredibly high. And given that energy is expensive, CCS is going to be expensive, and so blue hydrogen will be expensive. So green, not blue, in my opinion. In relation to oil and gas licenses, I'll just pick that up very briefly. I think, again, this comes back around to the CCS point and negative emissions. I think the government and policymakers have a very overly optimistic view on negative emissions and how much they can deliver in the future. And obviously, you can apply CCS to oil and gas, as well as remove CO2 from the atmosphere, then that creates the conditions to allow more oil and gas in the future. I would really warn here that both CCS and negative emission technologies, as I've said in the 10 minutes, embody a huge amount of risk and are likely to massively underdeliver and be really expensive and create land tension and food price rises. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Does anybody else want to comment on those, or should I go to the next three? Okay, I'll go to the next three. What will be the impact on water quality by creating hydrogen? Should I be replacing my gas boiler with a new German hydrogen-ready boiler? And all the electricity generation profile predictions for 2040, should they include electricity generated by nuclear fusion? Jack, do you want to start with those? What will be the impact on water quality by creating hydrogen? Should I be replacing my gas boiler with a new German hydrogen-ready boiler? And all the electricity generation predictions for 2040 should they include nuclear fusion, electricity generated by nuclear fusion? Jack?
Sure. So you're probably better off getting a good. I don't think it will impact water quality, but you're probably Okay, yeah, Richard's shaking his head at that. So no, I don't think it will. But yeah, ask a proper hydrogen expert. I'm not quite that clued up on hydrogen and water quality. In terms of the hydrogen boiler, I would actually recommend taking advantage of the government's new boiler upgrade grant and getting yourself a heat pump, because they're much more efficient, and hydrogen for heat tends to not be such a great idea, just because there's an extra step in the process, so it will be more expensive, and we're going to need a lot of hydrogen anyway before we start replacing our heat with it. So I think heat pumps are probably the way forward more than hydrogen boilers. Well, heat pumps and insulation actually would be my two main options. And turning to nuclear, I think there's definitely, well, obviously going to be some nuclear in the system. Generally, I think offshore wind in particular is going to be the workhorse of our power system in 2050 and beyond, because it's just so cheap and plentiful. But there is some exciting stuff going on in the nuclear space. So it's not just the old sort of like 1950s, 70s style big reactor plants. It's also small modular reactors, which will hopefully be coming online soon if the technology evolves and the costs come down, which could have some pretty exciting applications, particularly like heat networks for cities, for example. But again, the technology isn't here, so it's a bit like Daniel was saying with CCS. You sort of have to be a bit cautious, but also remain sort of techno-optimistic, because I think in general we probably need to be chucking all sorts of research and development at the net zero problem.
Anyone else want to say anything about those? Daniel, Richard?
I would completely agree with Jack's comments on heat pumps and hydrogen. I think hydrogen needs to be used for high temperature heat processes, industrial processes in the first instance, and I think it's going to be a long time before we see hydrogen being available for domestic heating. So heat pumps are definitely the way forward. I think on nuclear, my old background was working in particle physics and nuclear. So I suppose I like the technology. I don't like the externalization of the costs of dealing with the radioactive waste afterwards. I think the public purse is burdened a lot with containing the nuclear waste that we currently have, and that is growing. And that detracts from being able to do other things in terms of decarbonisation. So I think if we're going to have more nuclear, we do need to face up to the fact that we are creating a legacy of pressure on the public purse to contain that nuclear waste, because we don't really have a way of dealing with it. And if we do find those ways, then I'm fairly in favour of nuclear, but that is a large caveat.
Thanks very much. And then probably the last three, we have touched on some of this already. How do we tackle the intermittency of solar and wind? Richard says batteries will never store more than a few days' power. Can hydrogen do it, and how will it work? So a lot in there. Intermittency of solar and wind, believes in the limitation of batteries. Can hydrogen make that up? Can we essentially, can we do more to develop the industry for battery storage? So a related question there. And then a few questions about solar panels on roofs, included from Paul. How do we incentivize companies on business parks to have them on their roofs? Tony asks, why don't we make it mandatory to have them, particularly in new build and when refurbished? So intermittency of solar and wind, and whether batteries and or hydrogen can ever fill that gap. Should we be doing more to help battery storage, and questions about solar panels and getting more of those on our roofs? Do we incentivize them? Do we make them mandatory? Richard, why don't you go next?
Yeah, I'll pick up on intermittency, because it's one of those sort of questions we hear a lot, and actually it's not a huge problem that I think we need to be worried about. So first of all, the more solar wind you have on the system, the more you have actually variable but very rare variable generation, but very rarely would you have no generation. So if you think of all the offshore wind farms hundreds of miles apart from each other around the north, south, east and west, it partly solves the problem. And the other big thing we need to think about is it's very rare for it to be a really big problem. So you can use batteries in the short term, you can use interconnectors, you can use demand side response. What's that? That's maybe when you would pay a company with huge refrigerators to turn them off for a couple of hours because it doesn't affect their food production, but actually they don't need that electricity. So in the short term, you can manage it. The big question, the elephant in the room, is what do you do in winter? What happens if you have a week when there's very little sun, very little wind? Everyone else has the same problem, and that's where something such as hydrogen comes in, where you would store large amounts of hydrogen in offshore salt caverns, and you would burn the hydrogen in normal hydrogen-powered gas stations, and that's what would solve your problem for that week. It would be a very expensive way to run electricity just for those few days, but over the case of a year, actually that cost is very, very little. So that's the long-term solution. In the short term, you will find a different number of storage solutions to come up with that answer, but it's a cost issue. We're never going to have the lights go out. It's just how can we find the lowest cost method to solve this problem. It's not a huge problem in my view.
Okay, thank you very much. Jack, would you like to say something about those things?
Yeah, I'll speak to, because I agree with everything that Richard just said, basically, especially on storage. I'll speak to the last point on rooftop solar. I've met a couple of businesses now who are doing some pretty cool things where rather than just a company, say, paying for solar panels to be put on the roof, and then they make the use of that really cheap energy. Because if you're a small business, you might not be able to afford like £1,000 or something now to put on solar panels, especially with the cost of living at the moment. There are businesses that are saying, we'll install them for free and then we sell you the energy. And then if you sort of do that with across an industrial estate, for example, that sort of increases the economies of scale and the efficiency, and it brings down the cost. There's quite innovative financing mechanism, basically. There are some like snag issues. So like if you're a business and say you don't think that you're going to be there in 15 years time, so you don't want to take on this contract, then you might not want to go there. But I think basically the market is moving to install a lot of solar on rooftops. So watch that space, basically.
Daniel?
Yeah, just really briefly, again, I agree with everything that both Jack and Richard just said. I think it's important to highlight in relation to heat pumps. So just step back a second. So I used to model supply demand at a high temporal resolution across different energy scenarios, looking at government scenarios, et cetera, et cetera. So I know the intermittency problem well. I agree with Richard that it's essentially not a problem. Where it does become a problem is if you electrify heating, because heating is much greater demand than traditional electricity and much peakier. So if we have lots of heat pumps, we need to start to ask the question, how do we bring that demand and that spread out that peakiness of that heating demand? Essentially, that requires insulation, because we've got such leaky homes in this country. Unless we insulate, we're not going to be able to electrify heating through heat pumps at the scale that's going to be required. And just briefly on the battery question, what needs to happen in the battery sector? I think there's actually one very simple solution, which is to engage the what's it called? The insurance industry, because at the moment you cannot get insurance if you stack batteries. So if we want to conserve land and have lots of batteries, we need to be able to stack them on top of each other, but they present a fire hazard. So we need to deal with that fire hazard and get the insurance industry on board such that we can stack them higher, reducing the amount of land that they take up. I'll leave it there.
Daniel, thank you very much. And to all three of you, thanks for doing a great job getting through those questions. I think we covered pretty much every topic, if not every question. If anybody has any other questions that they want to send in to me, then please do feel free to do so. I did have Daniel, Sue did ask whether the things you'd said were in a Chatham House report and whether you could share the link for that. So she, and I'm sure other people would support that. I am just, Alec was on here. There he is. I was about to squeeze in one more question, but I'm not going to do that now. So, so thank you very much. Any other questions you didn't get an answer to, please do send them in. But in the meantime, Daniel, Richard, Jack, thank you so much. That stimulated a hugely valuable discussion. So thanks for your time.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Yes.
Have a great day.
Thank you. Right. Well, I was delighted to secure Alok Sharma for this climate summit. That was the main keynote speaker that I wanted for this year, because COP26 had been a lot of the focus of last year and beyond, and he continues his role as COP president. And I think, you know, while people feel there are other things we could have had, I think the general consensus is he did an exceptional job trying to get the global community into the right place on this. So I'm absolutely delighted that he's joining us here today. He will speak for 15 to 20 minutes about the current state of play and then take your questions. It's worth saying that he is not the Secretary of State for BEIS. His role has been very much about the global commitments that countries are making. He's spending his time with those countries all around the world. So it's the best questions to him probably are about what's going on internationally rather than necessarily in the UK. He can answer questions about the UK, but he's not in BEIS anymore. That is handled by Kwasi and the team there. But I thought it would be really valuable to understand where the UK is in relation to trying to corral the world into doing the right things. Alok, over to you.
David, thank you so much for inviting me. It's an absolute pleasure to join, and thank you for everything that you do, both nationally and of course locally, on the climate agenda. So, I mean, I will speak, as you said, for some minutes and basically set out, you know, how we got to COP26, and then, of course, very importantly, what progress we've made since then. And I would just say to you that I think even going into COP26, we saw that the international geopolitics was becoming more difficult. And yet, what we managed to do was to get almost 200 countries to agree to the Glasgow Climate Pact. And the reason they did this is because they understood that it was in their self-interest to deal with this issue. You know, over last year, I have visited very many countries. I've had an opportunity to speak to presidents, to prime ministers, to ministers. And this is one issue where there is a sense of a unity of purpose. And I think that is why we managed to get this pact over the line. Of course, those of you who watched it will have seen there were sort of wobbles towards the end, the final few hours. But I think it's because we had built the trust over the previous 2 years that we were able to get this deal over the line. And I mean, just looking back at some of the things that were achieved, you know, when we took on the mantle of organizing COP26, less than 30% of the global economy was covered by a net zero target. We worked with partners around the world so that by the time we got to COP26, 90% of the global economy was covered by a net zero target. We managed to get every country to sign up to looking again at their 2030 emission reduction target by the end of this year. Normally, this is a sort of 5-year cycle. We managed to make progress on finance. We got more finance commitments, but also importantly, a commitment from developed nations to make sure they double the amount of money that goes towards adaptation finance in supporting developing countries. We got, for the first time ever, language on coal in the agreement itself. This is the first COP in 26 COPs where we'd managed to get agreement on coal. As you know, the agreement was that countries would agree to phase down the use of coal domestically. And then I think this was also one of the first COPs where we had a big representation from the business community. And I think that was actually very important because whilst the negotiations that happen amongst countries are of course vital in terms of setting that international agenda, I think getting international businesses to make their own commitments is also really very important. So if I pick a few of these out, by the time we got to COP26, we had 5,000 international businesses signed up to the UN's Race to Zero campaign, which commits them to reach net zero by 2050 at the latest. That number has grown to 7,500 now. So we have continued to push on this particular agenda. We had financial assets representing from around the world, representing $130 trillion of assets signed up to net zero as part of the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. And of course, the challenge now is to ensure that this money is then also deployed in developing nations around the world to help them make a clean energy transition, to help them invest in climate resilient infrastructure as well. And I think we were able to say with some credibility that we had kept alive the prospect of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And as you know, this was part of the agreement that was reached at the historic agreement in Paris, where countries agreed to work to limit global temperature rise to well below 2 degrees, moving towards 1.5. Now, there may be some, and I don't think there's anyone coming to this conference will feel this, but there will be some people who will ask the question, well, 1.5 degrees doesn't sound like a lot. I mean, why is this so important? Well, we all know that the IPCC set out a report last year, which, based on the science, tells us that we're already at 1.1 degrees of global warming above pre-industrial levels. And you just have to see around the world what that means. So last year, we had terrible flooding in China, in Central Europe, loss of life. We saw wildfires raging in Australia, in North America. And of course, this year, you will have seen there have been record temperatures and heat waves recorded in Pakistan and India, 1 billion people facing up to 50 degrees in temperature. And frankly, I think we all know there is only so much that the human body can take. And I've just returned from South Africa. Again, in South Africa in recent weeks, we've seen terrible flooding in KwaZulu-Natal with hundreds of lives lost. And I've also had the privilege over the time I've been COP President Designate and COP President is actually to go and meet people on the front line of climate change. I was in Barbuda last year, and this was an island that was hit by a hurricane back in 2017, Hurricane Irma. And actually standing on that island and looking around, I mean, literally devastation was still all around me. And it literally felt like a hurricane had come in a few weeks earlier. Roofs blown off buildings, walls crumbling, and actually people forced to migrate from their homes. And when I spoke to those who were still on the island, what they said to me is that their big concern is, of course, the rebuilding, but also the fact that these climatic events are becoming more frequent and more ferocious. And therefore, their big appeal was to the biggest emitters to tell them to do more in terms of cutting emissions. I was in Nepal. I went to meet mountain communities who, again, were forced from their homes by a combination of melting glaciers and drought. I've been to Jakarta, where I've seen a seawall which is literally being added to every few years because of rising sea levels to protect the city. And if I give you a sort of a couple of estimates of where scientists think we might be at 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees, at 1.5 degrees, the estimate is that 700 million people across the world will feel extreme heat a very large part of the time. At 2 degrees, it's 2 billion people. At 1.5 degrees, 70% of all the coral reefs disappear. At 2 degrees, they're just about all gone. And the one thing I think every country recognizes is that climate change does not respect borders. And you know, the reality is that the cost of inaction, of not dealing with this now, is going to be a lot higher in the future. I mean, many of you will be familiar with the work of Lord Nick Stern, a brilliant man who brought out the Stern Review some years ago. And in that, the estimate is that unmitigated climate change could cost up to 20% of global GDP. Just last year here in the UK, we had the Independent Office for Budget Responsibility set out a risk report which said that, again, unmitigated climate change could lead to national debt reaching almost 300% of GDP by the end of the century. I mean, that would be a terrible legacy to leave our children. And that's why we need to take action now. And of course, there are, again, other risks which basically are exacerbated because of climate change. I mean, take water security, food security, migration, all of this, which are referred to as sort of cascading risks by folks like Chatham House. You know, this is all exacerbated because of a changing climate. So having told you the situation, the really grave situation we find ourselves in, what is the upside? How do we get ourselves out of this? Well, it is basically what, as a government, we are looking to do, and we're urging others to do, is to follow the path to a net zero economy. And it can be done. Over 30 years, the last 30 years, the UK has managed to grow its economy by over 80%, GDP up by over 80%, and yet we've managed to cut emissions by over 40% at the same time. So we are able to demonstrate that this can be done. And you will have seen that the government has put out a net zero strategy. We've put out the 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution when I was business secretary. And all of this adds up to ensuring that we are investing in the sunrise industries of the future. And we are looking to ensure that we can get £100 billion of £100 billion rather, of private sector investment into the green economy, creating around 500,000 jobs by 2030. And it's working. Investment is coming in. I mean, we have one of the biggest offshore wind sectors in the world. And you will have seen from the energy security strategy that was published a few weeks ago, the aim is to quintuple that in size. And actually, business leaders as well are rising to the challenge. I mean, they have understood that it is good for the bottom line to follow this net zero agenda. And in fact, 60% of the FTSE 100 companies are now signed up to net zero as well. So there is a big focus on this. And actually, you will have seen from the latest IPCC reports, which firstly do say that the window we have to act is closing. But it also makes the point there are technologies out there already, technologies when it comes to renewables, when it comes to electric vehicles, which can be deployed across the world so that we try and hit this target of net zero by the middle of the century. Now, we also have to recognize that the world has changed over the last few months. And we've seen this with Putin's illegal, unprovoked and brutal invasion of Ukraine. And understandably, climate is not on the front pages. But one thing I think governments have learned to understand is that climate and environmental security are totally interlinked with energy and national security. And that's why you're seeing the response to this war, with many countries making commitments to accelerate the pace of renewables. So you also asked me, David, to set out what we've achieved since COP26. Well, if I was going to give you a summary scorecard, I would say, yes, we've made some progress, but not enough and not fast enough. We've got 13 new NDCs that have come forward. I took part in the Major Economies Forum organized by President Biden in the last few days, and we had 7 of the big economies coming forward saying that they were looking actively at revising their 2030 emission reduction target. I co-chaired a meeting of almost 50 governments in May, which we held in Copenhagen, where again, I was encouraged by what I heard. So there is progress being made, and there's progress being made on finance, but not fast enough. And what needs to happen is for countries and also companies to quicken the pace and to ensure that we are able to say that by the time we get to Sharm el-Sheikh, that we have strengthened the pulse of 1.5. I said at the time of Glasgow that this was a fragile win that we got with the Glasgow Climate Pact. But the only way that we strengthen the pulse of 1.5 is to deliver on all the commitments that were made in Glasgow. So this year, for me, has been all about pushing forward on implementation. And we will keep going until we hand over the presidency in November to Egypt. And we're, of course, working closely with them as well. And frankly, many of you in the audience today will be people who've been engaged on this issue for very many years. And I know you will agree with me that we owe it, world leaders particularly owe it, the world leaders who came and made commitments and promises in Glasgow, owe it to future generations to ensure that we are able to say in Sharm el-Sheikh that we have made progress and we are delivering on the commitments that were made in Glasgow. Thank you very much for listening to me, and I'm very happy now, David, to take some questions.
Thank you very much, Alok, an excellent summary of the position that we're in, and the questions have been coming in thick and fast. The first question from Mike was the Russian invasion of Ukraine could speed up or delay the achievement of net zero. On balance, which is the more likely outcome?
Yeah, well, I think it's a great question. I mean, the geopolitics has changed. And I think what we're seeing also as a result of this is that countries are understanding that relying on fossil fuels, particularly controlled by a hostile actor, makes you pretty vulnerable. So I do think as a result of this, we will see a big acceleration on renewables. You see countries, I mean, Germany, for instance, has set out that they want to be, as part of their electricity mix, 100% renewables by 2035. The UK, again, already had a commitment to 100% of our electricity coming from clean energy sources by 2035. And then in our British energy security strategy, we have set out that we want 95% of our electricity to be generated from clean energy sources by 2030. And we've set out the plans to quintuple the amount of offshore wind and solar as well. So I think you will see this acceleration, but I think we also have to be frank. We have to recognize that as part of weaning themselves off of Russian hydrocarbons, some countries may well use more fossil fuels to meet their immediate energy needs. But what this should do is allow countries the space to then work towards accelerating their clean energy transition. And it's not just in Europe. I mean, I'm seeing this across the world. I talked about the fact that the UK, with other developed nations, has set out $8.5 billion worth of support to help South Africa make a clean energy transition. We're doing the same thing, working with a number of other emerging economies as well. So on balance, I do think we will see a big acceleration on renewables over the coming years.
Thank you very much. The next question was from Kath, who says, why, when it's so urgent to act in order to save the planet, do all the countries insist on saying it's not affordable? Do they not understand there may not be a country to govern unless they act sufficiently now? And I wonder just if I could tack on that, Alok, when you're having conversations with countries, and obviously you've gone from a third to 90% making commitments, which is fantastic. For that remaining 10%, what is it that they're saying? I mean, is it, as Kath suggests, they're saying, well, it's not affordable, or is it something else?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there are two things. So I agree with Kath, and as I said out in my opening remarks, I think the cost of inaction is going to be a lot greater than the cost of taking action now. And in fact, if any of the individuals who are taking part in this conference are involved in the insurance industry or talk to people in the insurance industry, they will tell you that actually the costs are mounting because of the impact of climate change. So I think the issue in terms of affordability, I mean, you will know that every country sets out its nationally determined contribution, and that is made up of a proportion that countries feel that they can fund themselves from their own needs, and the rest they look for support internationally. I think what we need to ensure over the coming years is to make sure that it isn't just public money, but actually private money being deployed. As I said, in Glasgow, we reached this benchmark where $130 trillion of assets have committed to net zero by 2050. Well, that money then needs to be deployed in net zero projects. And what we need to ensure, and this is what we're also doing through the work with other countries as well, is that that private sector money is able to get returns as well. Because the reality is, the money that is being committed from London and elsewhere to net zero is ultimately money invested in pensions, money invested in people's investments, and it's right and proper that the private sector gets a return. But what we're working to do is, for instance, through the Just Energy Transition partnerships I talked about, is also helping countries to have regulatory changes within their own government mechanisms, which then allow the private sector to invest. And David, you talked about the remaining 10% that is not committed to net zero. Well, I think there are countries that have made not formal commitments, but have talked about the fact that they see the direction of travel to net zero. And of course, I would like us to get to a 100%. The key thing, though, is to make sure that developed countries to make sure that the private sector is able to support developing nations make that change, to leapfrog the dirty industries that frankly that the West has used to grow. And I think it is possible, and certainly that's what I'm seeing in the conversations that I'm having around the world.
Okay, thank you very much. The next question, which I think you have said some things about, but I will ask it anyway, from Rajan, is what does Alok Sharma have to say in response to Antonio Guterres' call for urgent action if our species is to have a good chance of surviving? And he goes on that is condemning of corporations and governments for their actions and inactions and so on.
Yeah, so look, my job over the last couple of years, and as I said, this continues until November, is to build consensus and is to drive forward action. And I think we got lots of great commitments at COP26. The issue now is to ensure that both countries and companies are delivering. So, my big ask of all the companies that are committing net zero is to set out detailed transition plans. Let's just see, how are you going to get there? Not just to say that, yeah, I'm going to be net zero by 2040 or 2050 in my business, but actually, what are you going to do by 2025? What are you going to do by 2030? And actually, the conversations that I have suggest to me that actually companies do understand this and are working on their transition plans as well. And I think for governments, one of the things that we achieved at COP26 was to close off what is referred to as the Paris Rulebook. So the Paris Agreement was, of course, a seminal moment, but that agreement was a framework agreement, and it left a lot of the detailed rules for future COPs to resolve. And basically, after 6 years, we had just some of the most difficult and intractable ones outstanding as we went into Glasgow. And we did. I think there was a lot of skepticism whether we would be able to do this, but we did manage to close off all of those outstanding rules. And so what we now have, for the first time, an agreement that every country will, on a standardized basis, report as part of a transparency framework, report their greenhouse gas emissions across different sets of gases, across different sectors of the economy. And frankly, we will be able to see then whether governments are actually sticking to the commitments that they have made. And that's why, I've also talked about the fact that not only do governments need to revise their 2030 emission reduction targets and align them with the Paris temperature goals, but also set out their long-term strategy. We've done that in the UK, but we need every country to set out a long-term strategy so we can see that sort of pathway to actually going to net zero. So, as I said at the start, David, this is all about implementation.
Thank you. And on that point, Richard asks whether you believe the majority of countries will hit their targets. He feels the UK is struggling to hit its target. It's obviously a point of debate, but do you believe the majority of countries will hit their targets?
Well, I think they need to hit their targets. Otherwise, I think what we're going to see is the impacts of a changing climate get worse and worse and affect very many millions of lives and livelihoods around the world. I mean, in terms of the UK, of course, what we have actually is a pretty sort of rigorous framework for ensuring that we effectively stick to our own commitments. We're one of the first countries to set out in legislation a net zero commitment. We also have, as many of your colleagues taking part will know, formal legally binding carbon budgets. So we've got a carbon budget 1, 2, and 3 where we've sort of met or sort of somewhat ahead. We are working to ensure that carbon budgets 4 and 5 are met as well. And then last year, we also passed into legislation carbon budget 6, which is a commitment to reduce emissions by 78% by 2035. Now, I can tell you from the work that we do as part of the various cabinet committees that we have on this, and I chair the implementation cabinet committee on climate action. There's a lot of detailed work that goes into this when we come up with these estimates. So I can tell you, if you look at our sort of net zero strategy, for instance, which actually has been praised by the Independent Climate Change Committee, it sets out a pathway of how we're going to get there. I mean, none of this is easy, right? None of this is easy. It's not easy for the UK. It's not easy for other countries as well. But we have to deliver on this, because if we don't, I'm afraid things are just going to get far worse, and we can't afford to be in a position where we are seeing global temperatures rise inexorably.
Thank you. Next question from Reggie, which is, what does Alok think about fossil fuel companies' plans for projects for more exploration for gas and oil, something that's obviously going on around the world at the moment?
Yeah, so I mean, let me answer this from a sort of both an international and also sort of a national perspective. Now, I think as David said, you know, I'm no longer Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. That's something I stopped doing when I went full time into this role at the start of 2021. But let me try and sort of address this. So internationally, going into COP26, the UK had the presidency of the G7, and Italy, with whom we co-organized COP26, had the presidency of the G20. And one of the things that we were really very determined to do was to get commitment from both the G7 and the G20 to end international financing of coal around the world. And you know, we managed to do this. It was really very, very tough. Doing this as part of the G7. I then took part in the G20 climate and energy ministers meeting in July in Milan last year. And we weren't able to reach agreement on the G20 saying no to international coal financing. But by the time we got to the leaders event in October, just before COP26, we did. We got that commitment. In the last few weeks, I've taken part representing the UK in the G7 Climate, Energy and Environment Ministers meeting in Berlin. And we got a commitment from all countries to, firstly, phase out domestic coal, but secondly, to end international fossil fuel financing by the end of 2022. And all of this, I can tell you, makes a big difference, because firstly, it sends a message that actually, you know, countries, developed countries, you know, big nations are not going to fund fossil fuel projects elsewhere. But secondly, it also makes private investors think very carefully about where they may end up with stranded assets if they invest now in something that, frankly, is going to become redundant in coming years. And then from a UK perspective, you'll all have seen that we've set out very clearly that when it comes to any future oil and gas licenses, we will have a climate compatibility checkpoint, and the granting of any future licenses would have to be compatible with our legally binding climate commitments. I mean, none of that goes away, right? We are still required legally to be net zero by 2050. We are legally required to meet our carbon budgets, and that's what drives forward the work across government.
Thank you. Next question is from Paul. COP26 was an achievement for carbon emissions. Methane is 25 times more powerful in global warming than carbon dioxide. The elephant in the room is animal agriculture, which produces as much global warming as the carbon dioxide produced by all transport worldwide.
Yeah, so I think the question is around methane. What are we doing? So one of the things that happened at COP26 was a methane pledge, which actually the EU and the US sort of led on. And we've got very many countries that have signed up to reducing methane emissions by 30% by 2030. And of course, this matters, yes, in the agri sector, but it also matters in the oil and gas sector, you know, in terms of flaring, in terms of leakage. So I think it's great that countries have signed up to this pledge. From a UK perspective, of course, we have over the previous decades actually cut our own methane emissions significantly, and there is work going on a sort of sector basis, looking to see how we can indeed reduce methane emissions further. But I think the question is absolutely right. You know, if we're able to cut methane emissions by 30% globally by 2030, that will make a big dent in ensuring that we are able to arrest global warming.
Thank you. The next question is about a sort of fair and equitable transition. So Steph says we need to reduce energy and resource demand to address what she calls an ecological overshoot in most of the developed world. How do you propose we manage the reduction in demand in a fair and equitable way?
Yeah, so look, I think there are two sides to this. Let me first address the sort of developed country issue, but then also actually very importantly the developing economy issue, because that's where you're going to see the biggest growths going forward in terms of energy needs. So from a developed country perspective, I mean, clearly you need to ensure that the different sectors that you have, you're cutting emissions. So for instance, in terms of transport sector, which is responsible for a significant amount of emissions, we have a big push on electric vehicles. And when I was business secretary, we made the commitment that actually new car sales would be low emission, zero emission from 2030, and we're seeing other countries follow suit as well. I think that is one of the ways that you go forward in terms of reducing not necessarily the energy demand, but ensuring that it is clean energy that you are using. The second area, I think, is, for instance, on buildings. So we have a heat and building strategy, and it is about ensuring that there is less energy demand coming from buildings, both actually through insulation, but also the way that you build and design buildings as well going forward. So there's a whole sort of piece of work that is being done in developed countries in terms of addressing emissions in individual sectors. Now, from the perspective of developing countries, look, I've been very clear on this, which is that I do not think that we can ever say to a developing nation, would you please just curb your growth because actually developed countries have been using up the carbon budget. We can't do that. I don't think that's equitable. I don't think that's fair. What we can do, and what we are doing, is to ensure that we support those countries make the clean energy transition that they actually want to do. So, you know, take a country like Vietnam or Indonesia, for instance, huge potential for wind and for solar. What we need to ensure is that as those economies grow and their energy needs increase, we help them to put more renewables on their grid. And you know, I talked about the Just Energy Transition partnerships that we're working on. That's what it's about. It's about making sure that there is finance, public finance, of course, from developed countries, but then also philanthropic money, private sector money going into making these transitions. And the final thing I want to say on this is that you know, I was in South Africa last week, and as well as meeting cabinet ministers and sort of pushing forward on our national and international agenda, I also met with miners, with trade unions involved in this. And of course, you know, for them, yes, they want to be part of a clean energy transition, but they also want to ensure that their members are still going to have jobs at the end of this process. And that's the sort of the just element of a transition. And so what we need to ensure through the funding that you know, we support developing countries with, is that part of that funding is also used to retrain and reskill people, and to make clear that this transition isn't about flicking a switch you know, on or off overnight. That's not the way it works. So the way this will work is that we do this in a managed way, and we see it as a transition, and we take local communities with us. That's how actually internationally we are going to deliver both support for the move to net zero, but also at the same time safeguarding jobs and livelihoods.
Thank you. The next question is from a different pool, but about biodiversity. The cost of climate change could include potentially disastrous effects on biodiversity. And Paul asks, would it make sense to combine intergovernmental efforts to prevent, limit climate change whilst protecting the biodiversity upon which all life depends?
I think, David, that is really a great question, because I mean, you know, climate change and biodiversity loss are two sides of the same coin. In fact, if you look at the UK's integrated review that took place last year, and then in our updated international development strategy, we make clear that actually tackling climate change and biodiversity loss remains one of our top international priorities as a government in terms of supporting other nations as well. And actually, there was quite a lot that was announced at COP26 on the whole issue of biodiversity and nature. So, for instance, we got 140 countries, over 140 countries actually, representing over 90% of the world's forests, signed up to ensuring that we were reversing deforestation and actually seeing the growth in forests by 2030. Now, it's one thing to make a commitment. The other is to ensure that countries do stick to this. We had, as part of another international meeting, a gathering of some of the nations that had signed up to this, and work out how is it that we effectively work collectively together to hold each other to account, to make sure that we are seeing progress on this issue. And then, of course, that there is a separate COP which deals with this issue of biodiversity, and the Chinese have been leading on this, and there will be further meetings on this later this year. And we want to ensure that actually what comes out of those out of that COP it also sets out a clear and ambitious framework to tackle biodiversity loss.
Thank you. Question actually from one of our panelists, but he says he can't post the question, so someone else has posted it for him, which is that whether you think negative technologies like carbon capture and storage can compensate for the new fossil fuel drilling licensing that's going on.
Well, I mean, so carbon capture storage, of course, is one of the technologies that is being worked on around the world. We've got countries looking at things like direct air capture, but the way we ensure that we're cutting emissions fundamentally is to make sure that we have clear plans for a clean energy transition across the world. I mean, my personal view is that our long-term futures do not lie in fossil fuels. And so what we need to ensure is that as we make that managed transition, we're pushing forward and accelerating the move to clean energy. And in fact, one of the latest IPCC reports, again, sort of makes clear that going towards more solar, going towards more wind, onshore, offshore, pushing forward on EVs is the way that you go forward. There's also enormous amounts of work and investment going on in terms of green hydrogen around the world as well. So I think we need to approach this through all the technologies that are available to us. But actually, if you're going to make a clean energy transition, the way to do that is to ensure you are accelerating on solar, on wind, which is the UK's plan. And I have to say, having spoken to very many governments around the world, that is something that internationally governments are very keen to see happen as well.
Thank you. And then final question, because I know you've got to go at 11:15. There's quite a few questions about housing, which is a sort of big issue for housing and buildings, and the emissions coming from those. Questions both about the UK, but also internationally, and countries gripping this challenge of the emissions from their homes and buildings, and what thoughts you have on that within the international commitments countries are making.
Yeah, so I mean, I think on sort of housing and buildings, of course, we have a sort of a decarbonisation strategy that the UK has sort of set out in terms of how we will deal with this issue. And I think different governments are approaching this in what makes sense locally for them. And so, as I said, I mean, the areas on insulation in terms of building codes for new homes is of course vitally important. But then I think just overall, this is about ensuring that the energy that is being used to heat our homes, to light our homes, to run our businesses come from clean energy sources. And that's why despite the terrible atrocities that we're seeing in Ukraine, this terrible war which is affecting so many things negatively. The one thing coming out of this is this realization that we need to accelerate to homegrown clean energy. That's how you ensure both domestic energy supply, but also you have a control over prices. And I think that is what we need to see moving at a much faster pace across the world.
Alok, thank you very much for giving up your time this morning. There's another 50 questions I could ask you. They've been flooding in, but I'm very grateful to you for giving up your time this morning. I know it stimulated a lot of important discussions on here. And thank you for all the work you've been doing, both in the run-up to COP26 and since, because of course this is a global issue, however well we do in the UK, though we must push ourselves as much as we can. So thank you very much for joining us. We're going to have a 15-minute break now. We've rejigged the time. Thank you. We've rejigged the timetable a bit due to some movement with some of the panelists. So we're going to have a 15-minute break. We'll resume at 11:30, actually with the session that was going to be a bit later on innovation. So some local companies are going to be talking to us about the innovative things that they've been doing. And so I will see you there in 15 minutes time. Welcome back, everybody. I'm just waiting on the other panelists for the next session to join because we've rejigged the timings a bit. So once they do so, we will kick off again. Ah, there he is. In which case, we will kick off. So in addition to all the fantastic local organisations that we have working on the ground across the constituency, encouraging people to do all sorts of valuable things as individuals, we also have incredibly high-tech, innovative science going on in places like Harwell and Milton Park and so on. And what I wanted to do with this session was just showcase a couple of companies which are doing very innovative things in this area that you may not have heard of, but which open up possibilities across a whole range of things we might think about. So I'm delighted that Hugh and Nick have joined us here. Both of them involved with the space cluster that we have. And that space cluster has got the highest number of, and this is an aside, but it's got the highest number of organizations working on space within walking distance of each other anywhere in the world. So I'm down there reasonably regularly, and I've been very impressed by the things I've heard in general. But these two companies have some very important messages, I think, about the environment and sustainability. So we're going to kick off with, who should I kick off with? Let's kick off with Nick, who's the managing director at Astroscale. First time I met Astroscale, we were, I think it was when Liz Truss came for a visit. She was in her international trade role, and I had no idea about what is going on in space and why that needs to be cleaned up as well. So Nick, over to you for 10 or so minutes, and then we'll go to Hugh, and then we'll take some questions.
Thanks very much, David. And thanks for the introduction and for asking us to join today. Can I assume you can hear me all okay? Excellent, thank you, just to check. I'd like to share a couple of slides, if I may, just to sort of bring what I'd like to say to life. So let me see if hopefully that will, can you see the screen now?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. So I'm actually going to talk a little bit today about some of the things that are going on in space, but from two perspectives. I'm, as David kindly introduced there, Managing Director for Astroscale Limited, based at Harwell, but I'm also chair of UK Space, the trade body for the whole of the space sector. So what I like in the UK. So I'll give a little bit of a perspective on what I've called net zero Earth. We all know about that, and how we need to move towards net zero space, which is, as David introduced there, a bit more about how we can clean up space as we are on the Earth at the moment. So I mean, what is UK Space? UK Space is a trade body for the space sector. We've been around for about 30 years. We represent many companies, about 170 companies across lots of different disciplines. You can see some of the sort of logos of some of the companies in UK Space, including Astroscale. That's the sort of a little A with an orbit around at the top there. But we support, in my UK Space role, we work very closely with the Space Agency, with the Ministry of Defence, organisations like Ofcom that sits in DCMS, UK Research and Innovation, obviously, worked extremely closely at Harwell with the Satellite Applications Catapult, again, partly funded by UKRI, and obviously with our colleagues in academia. And I know obviously Hugh's here today, that and from RAL, who has strong links obviously with academia too. Sorry, just hit the other one. And just to set the context a little bit, space is really strategic to the UK. I think the Queen Elizabeth carrier just would not function without space. In fact, when that deploys, it's in the Far East at the moment. It has a space liaison officer on board, and that's to ensure that all of the services and capabilities that are provided from space, think of GPS, think of Earth observation or intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, all of that is needs to be coordinated, and need to coordinate with our allies and partners as well, about how we use space to ensure that the mission for the QEC carrier works. On the bottom of this slide, you can see a diagram that shows lots of aircraft. And what I wanted to show from a strategic perspective is space plays into how we do better air traffic management. In fact, one of the companies in UK Space, Inmarsat, and another one called CGI, working very closely together with the European Space Agency to manage air traffic around Europe much more efficiently, and thereby saving in the order of 10 to 15% carbon by making the planes fly closer together in a safe and secure way, using satellite technology, both communications and navigation. So it's not just the Earth observation perspective, which I'll come on to in a second, which is essential for climate, but space plays a role in reducing carbon directly through transport networks and other things. To the right-hand side of this, you can see some images there depicting the amount of debris in orbit on the top right, which is growing fast, and then a mission which Astroscale actually have in orbit at the moment. That's called ELSA-D, End of Life Service by Astroscale. That's what ELSA stands for. And that mission, it was launched last year. It's been in operations for some time now. It was actually built in Japan, but operated from Harwell. And that mission, you can see two satellites in that image. Basically, we have a servicer with the solar arrays, you can see, and then a client mission, which is simulating a piece of debris. And that has demonstrated how we can capture debris and simulate debris in orbit, and then lower its orbit and allow it to burn up faster, thus removing some of that some of the debris that's in orbit. The other two things, so as well as being it's strategic for the nation, I think we can argue space is inspirational and it enables growth. Certainly, space plays an important role in the curriculum, all the way from early years right through to up to university, and it's something that some projects, like you can see there, the Rosalind Franklin rover that's being built in Stevenage, which will one day be on Mars and looking for life, really generate some inspiration there for our younger people, get them into STEM education and so on. In the middle of this slide, you can see a mission called Truths, which is a UK-led mission with the UK Space Agency that is absolutely fundamental to our understanding of climate change. This was proposed actually by the National Physical Laboratory, and a number of UK companies, including Airbus and CGI and many others, are working on this mission. It will calibrate our Earth observation systems so that we can really understand how the climate is being impacted through a number of different things. what space does is it measures what's called essential climate variables. I'm sorry if you already know that, but just to explain, these ECVs are defined by the UN. There's around about 50 ECVs that we need to monitor to check the impact of carbon and other gases on the atmosphere. And for example, it's sea surface temperature, it's sea ice extent, it's how much methane is in the atmosphere. That's examples of ECVs. And at least 50% of those ECVs can only be measured from space. So that's just explains the importance of climate monitoring from space. To the right, you can see some of the things that space enables: the digital ship, which is coming, much less crew on board ships, underpinning global trade. Really important during the difficult few years we've had through COVID. But global trade again is totally enabled by space through communications and navigation. Coming in, focusing a little bit more about what we're doing at Harwell. So Astroscale, a company that I lead in the UK, is one of a number of companies, over 105 companies now, employing 1,400 people at Harwell, at that campus. I'm sure Hugh will come on to this in a second, but we've flown, particularly with Raoul's leadership, 210 science instruments, again, many of those critical to climate science on Earth observation missions. We enable through the sort of cluster approach to work with other sectors like health tech, energy and quantum. Those clusters as well have strong levels of focus at Harwell. And we're supporting the National Space Strategy through the companies we have, through working closely with government and the Satellite Applications Catapult. So the National Space Strategy was published in September 2021. It's the first time the UK's ever had both military and civil space strategy, and that really underpins what we're doing. And one of the things in the space strategy, if you do get a chance to have a look at it, it has what we call a 10-point plan, and I know a number of other strategies do have that. And one of those on that 10-point plan obviously is focused on climate and its contribution to where space plays a major role. And another one is about what we call net zero space. So there's lots of debris in orbit. You can see some figures on this slide just to highlight and try and bring it to life. So if you think about the size of a tennis ball, there's more than 36,000 objects bigger than a tennis ball in orbit, and only a very small proportion are active satellites. If you get smaller, down to 1 centimeter, there's well over 1 million objects that size. So there's we need to use space for all the things I've talked about in the earlier part of this presentation, but we then need to protect the space environment. And you may have heard His Royal Highness Prince Charles actually starting to talk about this issue. He was at a climate summit in London last week. He wasn't actually there in person, but he had a recorded message where he really highlighted the critical nature of managing the space environment. So we're really pleased to have his support in this area. So low Earth orbit on the left, that's 200 to 2,000 kilometers in terms of orbit height. And then more traditional geostationary orbit, which is a long way from Earth, 36,000 kilometers out, is where satellites remain stationary with respect to the user. So they're orbiting the same speed as the Earth is turning. So there's two different areas that are and really important orbits that we need to protect going forward. The other thing that's going on in the space sector is the number of satellites is increasing rapidly. Here, this slide tries to outline that. So in 2020, only 2 years ago, we had about 2,000 satellites in orbit. By 2030, within 10 years, it's predicted to be 46,000. That's with all the mega constellations like OneWeb, like Starlink, that you might be able to see if you look up at night sometimes, some of the Starlink satellites moving. We're going to see such a lot more congested space, not only on the uncrewed spacecraft, also crewed. We're moving from the International Space Station, which we have at the moment, to multiple commercial uses of space with human spaceflight, with space tourism, but also putting actual space stations in orbit that are that will be manned. So this shows the sort of level of congestedness. So what we're doing at Astroscale based at Harwell is to create a way of ensuring safe and sustainable development of space for future generations. And that's what we're doing to achieve that is focused on how do we, as I've already explained, how do we address that issue? So many satellites in space. We're not refueling or recycling those satellites. That's not in the business model at the moment. What we're trying to do at Astroscale is to ensure that we can do that now. We can go up and service satellites like any other industry where you have post-installation servicing. Why can't we do that more in space? So what we're doing in Astroscale is to enable that vision. There's a big opportunity for in-orbit servicing. Some of the market analysts are predicting this area will be worth $14 billion per year up to 2030. So it's a big market that's growing, and we've got lots of supportive quotes. As you can see, that even the G7 last year in Cornwall made a big commitment around space sustainability. At Astroscale, just to highlight how we're achieving this, I've talked about ELSA-D, which was the first mission we've put in orbit. We're now moving towards, which will be manufacturing in Harwell in our new facility we're moving into in the next couple of weeks, manufacturing spacecraft that will go up, dock with other spacecraft that are defunct or have no fuel left, and we will bring them to a lower orbit so that they can burn up much faster. We've also got missions running with our colleagues in Japan, where we're doing active debris removal. So we're actually removing big objects. That image there depicts the top of a rocket that's in orbit that is what we call unprepared. There's no way of controlling it, and we need to go and dock with that object and bring it down and make it burn up faster. And there's other things that we're doing as well out in geostationary orbit. So you can see some of the services and products. Some of this will be built at Harwell. The company Astroscale has been recognized. ELSA-D we won a prestigious award, the Satellite Technology of the Year in 2021, and we're also been highlighted as Time 100 influential company. So this area, as you can see, I've explained the business and the market. This is a growing area, and we're really pleased to be, as part of the space cluster, working closely with colleagues there at Harwell. If you have any questions or you'd like to contact us, there's that slide there just to have that. Thank you, David. Hopefully that was enough time.
Yes, it was. Spot on, Nick. Thank you very much. And as I say, that when I made my first visit and discovered 150 million items of debris in space, that was certainly news to me. Perhaps not other people watching, but news to me. We're going to go straight now to Dr. Hugh Mortimer, who's a research scientist in the Earth Observation Division at RAL Space. Different angle, but same sort of sphere. Over to you, Hugh, and I've already got some questions coming in.
Fantastic, thank you, David. Nick, can I ask you to stop sharing your screen so I can populate with mine? And while Nick's doing that, I will just ask you whether you can hear me okay and whether you can see my slides in full screen, because I've had issues with it being in presenter mode. Oh, I know. Sorry, let's try this again. Sorry, because I've got a lot of videos, and so I need to make sure it's optimized for videos. So here we go again. Can I just double check that you can see this? Okay. Everybody, David, I can't see anybody, so can you shout?
Yeah, we can see it.
Can you see a video? Can you see the Earth moving? Can you see a beautiful image of the Earth's surface taken from space? Someone give me a shout.
Yes, we can.
Perfect, thank you. Brilliant. So Nick has done an amazing job introducing Harwell and our Centre of Excellence for Space Science, which is located here in Oxfordshire. And it completely leaves me free to talk about the importance of space observations and the role that space has to play on every single one of us, every single day of our lives, without us really knowing it. So I thought I'd start with this beautiful time-lapse sequence of imagery recorded from the International Space Station. It's currently orbiting at about 400 kilometers above our head, And other than the beauty and the wonder that these images show, I think it perfectly highlights the unique perspective that can be gained by stepping outside of Earth's atmosphere and looking at Earth from above. So Earth observation satellites enables us to look at every part of the globe, all extremes of the environment. And we are able to do that on repeat timescales, not just of days, but when you're in low Earth orbit, orbiting at about 400 kilometers, you're orbiting every 90 minutes. If you're in geosynchronous orbit, you can look and stare and observe the Earth continuously without any interruption. And due to the stability in the way these satellites are designed, they continuously observe not just for months or years at a time, but actually these instruments can be built so they operate for decades at a time. So this talk is really going to be focused on the importance of Earth observation, especially in light of how it can be used to tackle the existential threat of climate change, which due to its very nature impacts every part of the globe and every aspect of our day-to-day living. As I said, my name is Hugh Mortimer. I'm Senior Research Scientist at the Rutherford Appleton Laboratories, and RAL Space is really our kind of center of excellence. It's our national laboratory for space science. We provide support for academia, universities and university bodies, as well as industry, to get access to space, to help design and operate instruments when they're in space. And we have about 300 research scientists, engineers, all working on every aspect of space exploration. My area is developing new instruments to look at Earth and ways we can then utilize that to understand the environment that we live in. So when we talk about global challenges, there are many different ways that we can define and prioritize these challenges. One of the more easily digestible, if not quite depressing, is a list produced by the World Economic Forum, assessment of basically the greatest present day risks. And on the face of it, this document, this slide, might look quite dry, but actually is really insightful. Now, the risk report is published every year and details the biggest risk, or effectively global pressures, on the economic future of the world. Now, in this diagram, each diamond refers to a different risk. Each color defines a different sector. So the green in the center there shows all of the environmental risks. Now, I don't really expect you to be able to read and understand all of the different links between these items here, but what I want you to take away from this is how complex and interconnected they are. So interestingly, this figure was actually taken from the 2020 report published on January the 15th, just before the pandemic hit. And you'll notice that infectious diseases in the top left there is actually quite small. And actually in the main report, there was only 4 mentions of the word pandemic. Now this year's and the years before, in 2021, much greater number of mentions. There were 143 mentions of the word pandemic in last year's report. But even though COVID has had a global impact, it's still only second in the list next to climate change, which is still seen as our top concern. So we may think that space science and Earth observation is really the domain of engineers and physicists, but actually space data and observations from space has like a smaller or larger part impact to play on every single one of these risks here. And this chart represents, I think, the real challenge in tackling climate change. It's basically the complexity, it's the interdisciplinarity, the internationality, as well as the interconnectedness that makes it very difficult to find simple solutions to this huge intangible challenge. I think this is specifically the case for climate change. So the conceptual science behind global warming is actually relatively simple and easy to grasp, right? So I'll try and set it out here. I mean, you've probably heard this before, but effectively certain gases in the atmosphere absorb radiation and then emit in the infrared is thermal radiation, which just means they create kind of a heat and a blanket or a greenhouse-like effect. So these are the reasons you kind of hear these terms. That's it. In fact, that is literally all it is. That's all the science. And it was basically almost 200 years ago that the French physicist Joseph Fourier proposed that, I think it was 1824, that actually changes in the atmosphere could augment or change the temperature on the Earth. So it's over 200 years ago, this was first proposed. In 1861, about 150 years ago, Irish physicist John Tyndall showed that water vapor and also certain other gases could actually create a greenhouse-like effect. About 130 years ago, 1896, Swedish chemist Arrhenius first suggested that industrial age coal burning will enhance natural greenhouse gases and the greenhouse effect, and suggested that this actually might create a doubling of CO2, might create a warm up our planet by a few degrees. He went on in that paper to suggest that actually that might be beneficial for Earth, because we actually might be warming up the planet and it might be nicer. But so why has it taken us so long to prove this and actually disprove that it's not beneficial at all? Well, the main difficulty has been in demonstrating what Fourier, Tyndall, Arrhenius suggested is actually what is actually happening with the climate. It's mainly due to natural variability in the complex feedbacks, which, while we can observe, is very difficult to model and understand. And so we need large-scale observations, and we need standardized methods that have high enough accuracy that you can trust the data. And finally, all that needs to be done is over a long period of time, you'll be able to see the natural warming trend on top of natural variability and feedbacks. And that's where we are at the moment. The second huge challenge has been in communicating this effectively. And so while I've mentioned that climate change impacts everyone, it does. It impacts everyone, from politicians, business owners, your next door neighbor. So everyone becomes a stakeholder and everyone has a role to play. So convincing everyone, even those who are reluctant to make changes, has to be done in an effective way. Now, I've put this slide on because I think this was one of the most impactful ways recently of demonstrating climate change. These climate stripes, you may have recognized them, were generated by researcher Ed Hawkins at the University of Reading. He's a fantastic scientist, as well as really good scientific communicator. Really simple way of communicating the science in a way that's intuitive to grasp. Now, these climate stripes produced here for Harwell, so you can see how quickly over time the atmosphere has been warming up. And it's this Earth observation has a role to play in both evidence gathering and communication. The ability to monitor and validate models with real-time observation on global scales not only validates climate models, but allows environmental scientists to research relationships between different parts of the Earth system. So this is what space enables us to do. It enables us to look at the 5 spheres: the atmosphere, the biosphere, the cryosphere, hydrosphere, and lithosphere, and enables us to do that and understand the relationships between all 5 of those areas. Now, the UK provides leadership in climate change science, and through membership of the European Space Agency and programs such as the Climate Change Initiative, we can provide systematic coordination of weather and climate observations. These observations began in the middle of the 19th century and have been made great steps forward in the 1980s with the realization and understanding of prediction of climate change through supercomputing and assimilation of Earth observation into large-scale numerical weather forecasts. Now, Earth system as a whole, weather, climate, oceans, land, and geology, now all of these ecosystems, we humans live inside, but we also change. So we need these accurate, high-quality observations at sufficient resolutions, both space and time, so we can understand how we are impacting the world that we are living in. So where does this leave us? Well, through our global observation campaigns, from both space and from the ground, we've gathered a huge amount of evidence for climate change. We've monitored the impacts of climate, and we provide the data that drive the climate models. And we do that through expertise and leadership at the Rutherford Appleton Laboratories and our space cluster at Harwell, but from our network of scientists around the UK. So we work very closely with private organizations as well as universities. And through this vast collaboration in combination with Earth system scientists, that we can work together to create this kind of this kind of pool of information that can be authored into a single document. Luckily, we've been having huge leadership in the UK in producing the 6th assessment report in the IPCC. But now this provides us with the latest up-to-date scientific evidence behind climate change. Now, Earth observation clearly is not the solution, but it's a hugely important one that's needed to better understand the impact, help generate actionable evidence that can underpin policy decisions, and how we can, and then give us understanding about how we can mitigate and adapt to climate change. But evidence is basically nothing without action. Now, as Albert Einstein implied, for a very different reason, evidence is nothing without this action. And I didn't really want to leave you with this sinister and kind of fairly downbeat message, but I thought I would leave you with a quote from Hemingway instead, that actually Earth is a fine place and it's worth fighting for. But I think it's one of these things that potentially controversially, I believe this goes for scientists as well working in this areas, our results have impacts and consequences. So I don't believe that we can just settle on publishing. We have to be active, both as communicators and advocates for climate change. And that's what I think we all have a responsibility to play, not just as scientists to communicate and gather the evidence, but also to communicate and publicly speak out about methods for becoming better climate change activists. Thank you.
Hugh, thanks so much. I've had 6 questions from 6 different people, so I'm going to do them in groups of 3, and if you can answer them pretty quickly. I know you've had to rejig the timetable, for which I'm sorry, but here come the first 3. So the first is from Damien. Would you like, it wasn't one of you, but I think either of you could comment. Would you like to comment on climate tourism and its impact on climate? We cannot afford that luxury, surely. The second question is, historically, space research claimed there were useful spin-offs. Richard thinks non-stick pans and microprocessors were credited. Are there any new products which can help us get to zero carbon as a result of what's going on in space? He's heard about high-tech insulation materials, for example. And the third is Heather. How can we justify the space-related emissions when we are struggling to get even close to net zero with Earth-based activity? So Hugh, do you want to say something about one or more of those 3?
I will take the. I think Nick's probably best for the last question on renewable space emissions. I'll go with the second question, which was about the outputs of space. Now, the outputs of space, I think people just try and see direct economic outputs from space. We've invested X million pounds, therefore we should see something, tangibly output from that. It's very difficult to put value on quantitative measures on data and information. It really, really is difficult for having value for money. The data that we get to produce our weather forecasts is predominantly from Earth observation data, from satellites, also from ground. The observations from space are put into numerical weather forecasts. They help improve the accuracy from the 1980s, where we weren't able to predict large-scale hurricanes coming in 3 to 5 days, through to now, where we have really accurate measures where we can save lives, we can tangibly save lives through satellite observations. And missions to do deep space astronomy are as important to do as Earth observation. Now, you might not think that. You might think we should put all our money into treating cancer, which is a fair comment. But actually, in the UK, the reason that we're a world leader in science is because we have a really even split where we fund our science. And it's the scientists who decide where that money goes. So we have a very equitable, we fund space science as equally as we fund medical science, as we fund environmental science, and each one of those things is important because there's interdisciplinary research that we can do. So we will develop new detectors in satellites that will then go on to medical research and that will then support potentially stuff in your camera phone, for example. So these kind of spin out. There's so many bits of kit that have been developed for space that are now in your phone that you wouldn't know it. But it's very difficult to track that directly, and you wouldn't want to. But so what I want to say is actually space science and our way that we fund science in the UK is, I think, excellent, and mainly because of the equitable split, and mainly because you don't know where the next Nobel Prize, where the next ability to come up with a vaccine or a penicillin or the next Nobel Prize is going to come from. So by funding all areas of science equitably, then we get much greater return for our money. Does that help?
Yes, thank you very much. Nick, quickly from you, and then I'll do the second 3 questions.
Okay, very quickly on the justifying space emissions. It's a good observation. I think the space sector itself, I mean, Hugh and I have talked about all the different applications that we rely on from space, and I've talked about how space systems can actually reduce emissions on Earth. However, I think probably a launch is the one, there's a lot of emissions that come from a launch, certainly what it looks like. But what we are doing with UK launch, which we'll be having our first launch from UK soil later this year, and then there'll be more coming. But many of those companies are looking at biofuels for use in the launch, which is much better for the environment. So there's big activities going on in the space sector on that.
Great, thank you. I'm going to stick with you, Nick. A 4th question has just snuck in, so I'm going to do the first 2 to you and the next 2 to Hugh. So the 2 to you are, so firstly from Sue, will all this junk and these new satellites actually create a shield from sun radiation and reduce global heating? And the second question, which I also think is very much for you, regarding space debris removal, what's to stop countries developing these techniques from working with dangerous governments to remove active satellites for potential war activities? And he gives the example of removing spy satellites over countries that they may wish to invade. So if you answer those, and then I'll give the other 2 to Hugh, and then we'll move on to the next session.
Yeah, I think so. Very good question. I think the junk creating a shield, it's unlikely. Space is very big. Satellites are quite small in comparison. The largest satellites we have in orbit are about the size of a bus, but they're out of geostationary orbit. So the ones down at low Earth orbit are much smaller. Okay, there will be some larger objects like tops of rockets, but they won't. Space is too big, I think, to create a shield that could then help us on the climate aspects. So that's basically the point there. Space debris removal and use for nefarious, if you want to call it that, activities. I guess that's possible. I think, we saw last November a Russian anti-satellite missile hit one of their own satellites to prove that they can blow up other satellites, which created a lot more debris, unfortunately, at least 150 new pieces of debris that we're tracking now. So it is a worry, but as I mentioned on the strategic point in my presentation, we need to be ensuring deterrence where we can. So we have we do invest in capabilities that do deter others, because we could do the same to their satellites. It's a horrible way to think, but unfortunately that's the way of the world at the moment. So that's something that the UK and other partner nations are investing in.
Thank you very much. And then the final 2 to you, Hugh. Stuart asks, how much of the research and activity in space is defense or military based? And Kath asks, why are we spending so much money on getting to Mars and finding out if it's habitable? Is there so little hope for life on Earth?
Can you just repeat the first question again? It was about.
This question is, how much of the research and activity going on in space is defense or military based?
It's an interesting question. All of the research councils spend £8 billion a year on all science. That helps answer the second question in a second. But the first question, the MOD has space assets. We call them up there. We call them facilities. We call them like space, space instruments in space. But at the moment, through the space science elements, all of really space that I know and use and see, and all the space that you see is actually kind of commercial space or research, publicly funded research. And I think the majority of what we have available to us in terms of instruments and satellites is mainly Earth obs. Now, I might be completely wrong with that, but because we don't see that side, it's the space science side is something very different. However, in the new National Space Strategy, we are looking at trying to tie up our military and civilian applications to see whether there are opportunities to use military space. Now, you might think, well, we don't like that, the whole non-proliferation of space, but actually, all again, GPS in your phone, all of that is all satellite enabled. It's from geostationary satellites providing timing signals to sensors on the ground that enables you to know exactly where you are. All of that was military. All of that was defense originally. And then over time, releasing that data to enable you, civilians, to have access to that benefit of being able to know where you are. And I think that's the same with space. That's kind of how information seems to travel. So it gets generated, it gets publicly IP, or it gets kind of privately locked somewhere. And then over time, it becomes more generally distributed. And people start to use that for different ways. And that's why Earth observation now is becoming more and more prevalent, because we're getting more data sets from space to be able to look at the landscape on higher resolutions, better definitions, more accurate wavelengths. On the second question, which was about why we're going to Mars, is exactly the same reason. It's really important to push the boundaries of science, just generally. So because you don't know where the next Nobel Prize is going to come from, to be able to explore Mars is the same, I would suggest, as doing some art research. But I passionate about art, passionate about communication, passionate about science, but I wouldn't say that one science is better than another, because it's equitably funded, it's peer reviewed, so all basically your colleagues are telling you that that's really important to know at this particular time. It has to go through a review process. You're not just given money to do something without any due care or consideration. And exploration is both really beneficial for public engagement, also for inspiration, but also some really interesting science that goes on in trying to achieve that. The last thing to note is we're going through a revolution in space at the moment. And we're going from 20 years ago, which was basically public funded exploration. So everything being government taxpayers' money to get to space, to give us data or to advance science. Now, however, we've got this advent of commercial space coming up, and it's coming up quickly. And I think that's exactly how it should be. Public funded activities to de-risk and a thing, and then commercial companies coming in to do it. And you would have seen that in effectively how we explored the world. Columbus went to America, funded by the royalty in Spain. I think it was Spain, anyway. My history terrible. But you can see that that's effectively taxpayers or public funded exploration, which then opened spice and trade routes, and also some other terrible trading and the consequences of that. But that is what exploration is, and that's what I think science is the kind of the new way of exploring, becoming the explorers of the world. Thank you.
Hugh, thank you very much. Nick, thank you very much. A fascinating session, and I've certainly learnt more, and I'm sure the people watching have as well. So thank you very much for giving up your time today. We are now going to move on to older children. So we're going to move on to secondary schools. And we did have more than this, but again, we had to rejig the timetable, unfortunately. So we have three schools, Wallingford, Didcot Girls and Branners. They are each going to give presentations on the same topic as we heard from primary school children at the beginning of the day, and we will do questions then to all of them at the end. We should still finish at about 12:40, which is when this session was set to end. And I'm going to go purely on the order that you guys are on my list. And I'm going to ask Wallingford School to go first, please. Wallingford School, I can see you. Not quite. There we go. Okay, yeah, all switch on your cameras ready for the next session, but Wallingford, if you can unmute, and we will hear from you guys first.
Sorry.
Don't worry. Don't worry.
Can you see that? We've made a presentation that hopefully you might be able to see.
I can't see it at the moment. You were screen sharing, but it showed me again. Now it's gone black.
If we go back to Zoom. Okay, and then we go back to screen share.
Sharing.
Yeah, but I think we click this screen instead of.
We could just go back to PowerPoint.
Yeah.
Shall we?
Click to do about PowerPoint. And then press it again.
It's with you now.
Shall we?
And then window. And then that. There we go.
Excellent. There we go. Right, now, before you guys kick off, tell everybody what year you're in.
We're all year 12s.
You're all year 12. Right, over to you.
Do you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I'd like to start by thanking Mr. Johnson for organising this climate summit. And the future of humanity currently stands on a knife edge. If we choose clear, coordinated and decisive action, there is a great potential for a green, prosperous future where solving climate change is combined with tackling social inequality and the world's other major problems. On the other hand, if governments continue to use external political and economic events as an excuse for a lack of action, it is difficult to see how we will meet the aims of the Paris Agreement. With only a handful of countries on track to meet the Paris Agreement, a failure of international cooperation at COP26, and many governments using war or economic recession as an excuse to avoid action, this seems to be the option we are choosing. This is why I'd like to start our presentation by focusing on the role of government in tackling climate change. When researching this topic, we considered a broad range of ideas, from radical transformations of our economy to more moderate reforms of certain sectors. I would like to clarify at this point that although in the end we picked a fairly modest, realistic proposal, there is much more the government should be doing to give us a fighting chance of net zero, such as halting the expansion of new oil and gas facilities. Nevertheless, it is evident that the UK has been successful in reducing emissions from certain sectors of our economy. However, there are other areas where our progress has been stagnant or in some cases non-existent. One such area is the housing sector. In 2019, the Climate Change Committee produced a report revealing that UK homes are not fit for the future, despite the fact that they account for 14% of the UK's carbon emissions. As part of their response, the government launched the Green Homes Grant, famously publicised and promoted by Rishi Sunak as a way to simultaneously lower carbon emissions, help struggling families, create jobs and regenerate the economy after the pandemic. Fast forward to March 2021. With only 7% of the intended homes upgraded, the scheme is scrapped and cast aside as a failure, leaving many businesses in disarray. Fast forward again to 2022, and war is ravaging across Europe, inflation is over 9%, and many people are having to choose between eating and eating. There has never been a more important time for its successor scheme to the Green Homes Grant. The Climate Change Committee have found that the UK's legally binding carbon targets will not be met without the near complete elimination of greenhouse gas emissions from UK buildings. If we want a chance of hitting net zero by 2050, retrofitting the UK's housing is a necessary and non-negotiable step. We can't afford to treat climate change as an isolated issue. It is inherently linked with existing social and economic inequalities. This scheme has the potential to help millions of struggling households and reduce the socio-economic divides in the UK. This is humanity's last chance to avert catastrophic global warming, and we can't afford to get it wrong again. I'll now hand over to Romy to talk in more detail.
So, what went wrong with the scheme? The Green Homes Grant Scheme went disastrously wrong due to too few Trustmark and SEA installers, with many prospective customers being directed to oversubscribed tradesmen on the other end of the country. People from Cornwall were being directed to tradesmen from Manchester. A complex structure, which was rarely explained well to customers and accredited installers, if at all, reducing the uptake. Short installation periods of 6 months, during which an installer must be found and project completed to remain valid. It didn't include Wales in the scheme at all. It was hard for rural communities and those off the gas grid to access the scheme, despite being the ones who arguably benefit from it the most. As has already been established, it didn't cover enough of the costs, particularly for the 58% of homes with an EPC rating of C or below. However, not all hope is lost. The scheme had considerable potential, but due to a lack of effective investment and construction of the grant scheme, it didn't live up to its promise. A way of killing two birds with one stone, tackles climate crisis as well as aiding with the cost of living crisis. Our propositions for what the government could do to make the scheme a success are as follows. Take the time to construct the scheme properly, rather than how Fee Skinner, Guardian interviewee, described it as having been cobbled together in a few weeks rather than properly thought through. Establish a simplified structure in order to promote the scheme to more customers and installers. To improve the latter further, help tradesmen get into the Trustmark register or on the SEA website. Prioritise rural communities, for instance, by providing early access to the scheme, and offer larger discounts to increase greening savings, making the scheme more attractive to those who need to pay larger sums of money. And I'll hand it over to Fern.
Hello. So I'm going to talk about the biggest thing that adults can do to have a big impact. So the biggest impact adults can have is to get involved politically. They have the power to create real change through voting for more climate action in their local parish and government. Adults are also more likely to have access to things like local plans regarding their area's environment and ecology. They're also more likely to get involved with environmental groups to support their causes and support environmental charities such as Greenpeace and WWF financially. Another way of getting their voices heard is to write to MPs and sign petitions. Adults as parents can have a huge influence by educating their children on how to live a more environmentally conscious life and the importance of why. Examples of these could be explaining the carbon cost of food and clothes so they can allow for their children to make better choices, such as a vegetarian diet and buying second-hand clothes that have proven to be a better effect on the environment, so they can be more environmentally conscious. And I'm going to hand over to Evie now, who's going to talk about what the youth can do.
Asking what young people can do about the climate crisis is often difficult. Children and teenagers tend to have less authority, autonomy, and often do not have the capacity to make drastic changes to their way of living. So we suggest that the most important thing that young people can do is make gradual, individual lifestyle changes in order to live a more environmentally conscious life. These could be drastic, going plant-based, buying only second-hand clothes, protesting, going plastic-free, or they could be small, buying vegan occasionally, composting, learning about recycling and reusing, avoiding plastic wherever possible, using sites like Ecosia, and engaging others in conversations about their environment, both locally and globally. There are hundreds of little everyday decisions that could be made to try and reduce your own carbon footprint and impact on the environment. We don't suggest or encourage complete upheaval of young people's way of life, but do suggest that the most important thing they can do is themselves make conscious, environmentally friendly decisions to the best of their ability as often as possible. In fact, we found out which of these changes our fellow Year 12s would be most willing to take. We sent out a survey to do during form times, and found that 40% would be most likely to change their travelling habits in order to walk or cycle more. And 35% said they would be more willing to buy second-hand clothes more often. Building habits like these at a young age provides a healthy framework for life in the future and indicates a great attitude towards the environment and what young people might be able to achieve in the future.
So in summary, what are the most effective ways for young people, adults and the government to tackle climate change? For government, there are obviously large-scale changes that our country needs to undergo, such as the transition from fossil fuels to renewables. A more specific goal is the introduction of a successor scheme to the Green Homes Grant to help tackle the cost of living crisis at the same time. Adults have a responsibility to ensure their local MP and local government are actively helping progress us towards net zero, and adults can help keep them accountable. This can be as simple as voting at elections for a climate progressive leader. Finally, as very active consumers, young people need to take responsibility for what they buy and take into account its environmental credentials. It's not an exaggeration to say that the fate of humanity depends on our actions in the next decade. We must act now.
Thank you very much, Warren, for school. Great way to kick off, and certainly I agree with a lot of the stuff you said, particularly about housing. So thank you very much. We're going to do questions at the end, so people should keep putting questions into the Q&A. We will go to Brian's school next. So over to you guys, and then we will do Didcot girls last but not least. So unmute yourselves, and over to you. Wallingford, you've stopped screen sharing, haven't you? Because we've got a view of you at the moment, but you've turned off screen sharing, haven't you? Yeah, fine. Thanks. Okay, Brian, it's over to you.
Okay.
And make sure you're unmuted.
Okay, can you see us?
We're muted.
Before you kick off, what years are you guys in?
Year 10 and 2 year 9s.
I don't think they can hear it. Can you hear us?
It's a bit quiet, so talk as loudly as you can.
Okay. Okay, so I'd like to join Wallingford School in thanking David Johnson for setting up this event to start off with. I think our presentation is slightly shorter than the one before, but hopefully it will be just as useful to the panelists here. I think we all agree that climate change is quite a serious issue, and our presentation focuses on the sectors of what government, adults and children can do as part of their daily lives to help save the planet. So hopefully you enjoy. So I'll pass on to Toby, who's going to do government.
So after considering the biggest things that the government should be doing to combat climate change, we decided there are a large number of things that they could improve on. Firstly, the government must subsidise public transport and deter use of cars. Currently, prices for bus tickets and train tickets are far too high, leaving little motivation for people not to just drive their cars. With a recent spike in fuel prices, people should be flocking to public transport as a cheaper way to travel. However, this is not happening. Furthermore, the government can invest in renewable energy. According to a report by researchers at Stanford University, the global cost of switching to 100% renewable, zero-carbon energy by 2050 would be just over £60 trillion. Now that sounds like a massive amount of money. However, this just makes it all the more astonishing that all of this would be paid back in under 7 years. After 7 years, we would be saving money at an astounding rate. Money that can then be put into funding yet more green infrastructure. Finally, the government can stop subsidising fossil fuels. This money, paid to oil rigs and coal mines, has much more potential in the hands of solar farms, wind farms, or nuclear fusion research. However, our current government have decided they would prefer to pay for the destruction of our beautiful planet.
Okay, so I'll be presenting the adults part. So we together have decided that adults should probably need to educate their children so they can spread the word that we need to combat climate change. So encouraging house rules, as said on next slide. They should also be encouraging one vegetarian day per week, which has been shown to reduce their CO2 emissions by 100 kilos a year. So researchers at the University of Oxford have found that cutting meat and dairy from your diet can help to reduce your individual's carbon footprint from food by up to 73%. Furthermore, the fishing industry has a massive impact on climate change, and the only way to eradicate this is to stop eating seafood, due to how hard it is to regulate the industry and the problem of overfishing. Finally, adults must be cautious about how their food's packaged and where it comes from. Air miles can add up, and they've really have an impact on the carbon footprint. What's it on?
And last but not least, what is the biggest thing that children should be doing to combat climate change? First of all, making on to what Owen just said, we think children should be researching and learning about climate change and its effect on the planet, so they can plan what they would do when they grow up. As children are the future for the planet, it is best that they keep up with what is happening with the planet and plan for the future. Additionally, they can, as one of his schools said, do little things around the house in their daily life that can build up and make a large impact over time. For instance, turning off appliances at the plug and lights, recycling whatever they can, and considering more about the impact and what they buy will have on our planet. You may be wondering about the relevance of the image on the right. It is a long exposure shot of a pitch black room with all the standby lights that activate and we don't notice. Whilst devices on standby don't use nearly as much energy as when they are on, they still use 2.5 to 5% of the active amount. This may not sound like a lot, but over time it adds up, and with many devices, simply turning them off at the plug is far more energy and in turn cost efficient. According to the Powering the Nation study completed by Energy Saving Trust, between 9 to 16% of the electricity consumed in homes is used to power appliances when they are in the standby mode.
So, from us at St. Bryna's School, we thank you for your valuable time and ask you to consider our ideas in order to get a safer world for us, the next generation. To summarise, we must educate children on climate change, invest in renewable energy, commit to vegetarian days, subsidise public transport, be conscious of turning off appliances, and we must end fossil fuel subsidies. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Brian. It's an excellent presentation. I particularly like the picture showing all those appliances on late at night. So thank you very much. Now, last but not least, Didcot Girls School, and then there'll be some questions for you. So now you guys look to be on several different screens. I'm going to leave that to you, but over to you guys.
Thank you once more, David Johnston, for organising this. Today, for what the government could do, we would like more focus on public transport. Only 11% of the population of the UK regularly uses public transport. This means there are more people in their cars, releasing more and more emissions, contributing to climate change. Reduce the number of cars on the road, the air gets fresher, the roads are not as congested. However, public transport is not to the standard people would be willing to use it. It should be more convenient, more routes so that anyone can catch a bus or train. Another thing is affordability. If you wanted to get somewhere and you had to choose between a £17 bus ride or your car, which are you going to choose? We are picking finances over the world. Public transport needs to be efficient, innovative, and affordable.
I think it's important to look at examples of nations who have been more forward-thinking than ours, who get to feel the pride of being the ones who have led the way in zero-emission public transport. Like in Denmark, early 2021, electric buses were making up 78% of its new vehicles, and they were closely being followed by Luxembourg and the Netherlands, who both had around 2/3 of new buses emitting zero emissions. These are achievements that our government, with all the money that they have, should have aspired to reach first. And our government needs to not only be looking at the progress when it comes to buses, because Denmark and the Netherlands also have some of the most excellent networks of bike paths and cycling systems, which is a great way to encourage lower greenhouse gas emissions. At the end of the day, it's the government's responsibility to provide the people with these opportunities, better buses and better cycling networks, in order for them to make cleaner, greener journeys that they can rely on and afford.
Good afternoon. I'm Lily, and I would like to talk to you about what adults can do to combat climate change. UK households produce 27 million tonnes of waste per year. 27 million tonnes. That's 409 kilograms per person. To put that into perspective, that's the equivalent to the weight of 4 adult giant pandas. This waste is mostly food scraps, newspapers, cardboard, glass bottles, and plastics. All of those things have simple ways to be disposed of responsibly. Whether it's composting scraps or recycling yesterday's paper, it's not exactly hard. So why? Why do adults in particular feel the need to be so lazy and so greedy? They are here to set the example for the future generations. So why aren't they? We're facing a climate crisis and we all need to do our bit. Don't be a bystander to a world that's overcome with waste and greed.
We also want to encourage adults to consume less energy and try to only purchase what they need or buy less, as this can help greatly. Another rather concerning issue is that the UK sends 700,000 tonnes of clothing out. 700,000 tonnes. Why are we buying so many clothes only to just throw them away? We could reuse them, donate to charity, or just try to cut down on the number of clothes, especially at Christmas.
We would also like to talk about what we think that children can do. Firstly, we must have hope. Sir David Attenborough said, "There's every reason to believe that the answer can be yes. If working apart we are forces powerful enough to destabilize our planet, surely working together we are powerful enough to save it." We must have hope because we can change the world, and for the better.
I think that the most important thing that young people can do is to take their heads out of the sand and look at the bigger picture, because they may not see it, but all their small actions really do add up, and it is not cool to be a bystander.
Okay, is that this? You guys finished, isn't it? Is it? Anybody else? Not if you're gone.
Sorry, we do not want ignorance to be a trend. We need the new trend to be action.
Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody. Another great presentation, and you agree with some of the other two schools about with some of the things that they've said. Let me ask you a question that the primary school children were asked earlier, which is, do you find yourselves having to persuade your parents of why this is important, or do your parents already understand? And the related question is, do you have to persuade other young people in the school why this is important, or do they already understand? So let's start with Wallingford School quickly. Do you have to persuade your parents, or do they already understand? Do you have to persuade other young people in the school, or do they already understand?
I feel like we, us group, we're quite environmentally aware, so our parents are quite environmentally aware as well, so we don't have to persuade them as such. For us, I think it is our peers that we are persuading, and maybe their parents as well. And so I think it is both a combination of parents and people our age. It just really depends on how you've been brought up. And overall, I think there is there is a need to educate parents more, so that they can spread that. So, does anyone else want to add anything?
Yeah, I think environmentally conscious parents raise environmentally conscious children. So most children like us don't have to talk to their parents, more other people
around us.
Yeah.
But it's still needed for other parents to be educated, because they're certainly out there.
Okay. Okay. Brianus, what do you say about that? Do you have to persuade your parents, or do they already know what they've got to do? And do you have to persuade other children and young people at the school, or do they already know what they need to do?
So I'd say that most parents would understand the gravity of the situation we're in, but perhaps don't understand quite how they would get themselves out of it through either lack of research or lack of education about it. And as for the students' side, I think that it's the school's responsibility to educate the students about climate change and the issues that are about it. And as part of the school council, we play a part within that, presenting assemblies and trying to convince students to do things like litter picks, which they just did. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And then anybody from Didcot Girls want to comment on this?
We find ourselves quite a lot. The students at DGS know what they should be doing. The biggest part is convincing them that actually it's not that they should be doing it, it's that they've got to be doing it. Otherwise, we're not going to see the change that we need to be seeing. With parents generally, it's better, but there is always the odd person who just really doesn't seem to understand the gravity of our situation. And a lot like what the other two schools have said, I think we really do have to focus on educating parents as well as children, because they are also educators in the children's lives. It shouldn't just be down to school. The parents should be trying to play their role as well.
Okay. Right, I've got a couple of questions about protests. So one from Doug asking whether any of you or your fellow students joined in with the school climate strikes, and do you think these have made any difference? And then one from Rajan asking whether you think protests by groups like Extinction Rebellion and Insulate Britain, whether you, it's quite a long question this, but basically wanting to know what you think about those sorts of protests being done by Insulate Britain and Extinction Rebellion. So have any of you been involved in school climate strikes? Do you think they've made any difference? And what do you think of the tactics being used by groups like Extinction Rebellion and Insulate Britain? And we'll start this time with Didcot Girls, perhaps someone else who'd like to have a go at that.
As a school, we do host many climate strikes. Not very often, but spread about. Yes, we do. Personally, I haven't been involved, and no one else in this group has been. But I know that it's something that we are actively seeking to be contributing to. For the other question about what we think of the climate strikes outside of school, I think they have made an impact, certainly getting recognition, but I don't feel like they've made as much as an impact as we would have hoped.
Okay, that's nice and easy to understand. Brianus?
So I will agree with the girls' school there. They do help. I think the thing is, they've got to be done right. There's a way of protesting that will actually have an effect and will make the government think, but then there's also a way that's just going to annoy people and get more angry about kind of climate conscious citizens almost. So I personally haven't been involved in any protests. I don't think these two have, but I certainly know people who have, especially in my primary school. There were a few people who went off some Fridays and protested. And I think, as much as anything, even if they don't have an effect on the government or the government's decisions, they still inspire passion from protesters, and even from people who may agree with the protesters but don't attend. They inspire a passion for them to do more, because it's almost long-term adrenaline, I guess, just inspiring climate action, even if it's not from the government.
Yes, so protests are obviously essential to the well-being of a country, as in, like, it ensures justice, ensures all citizens' views upheld. But obviously, we think it should never come down to violence, and especially recently, violent protests have been on the rise. So, yeah, we just want to say we don't support that in any way.
Okay, thank you very much. Wallingford School.
Okay, so I think we're all just going to chip in here, but I would like to start off by saying that I think most of us have been to these school protests, and I think they're not as effective as we want them to be, as your guys were saying. They do create motivation, and it is nice to know that there are other people who believe that this should change and action should be taken to prevent this disaster. But I feel like there's more people needed to get the government's recognition.
Something that I've noted, particularly with the climate strikes, is that going back to 2019 at the start, they were very effective. Like, I still remember the first few did have an impact. I think it was a couple of months after the first one that the government declared a climate emergency, and I think it has initially they had they were very effective, but I think over the years, as they've some of them have become slightly more extreme and also just a bit repetitive and disruptive, and perhaps their effectiveness has decreased. So I think overall they have been effective in moving the discussion forward, but I think we need to start thinking about new ways we can build, start making these protests more effective than simply disruption.
Yes. And you mentioned about having violent protests and things like that, and especially with XR and the other group that you mentioned. Insulate Britain, yes. I think that they are, at the moment, they seem to me like they're the people who care the most. And throughout, I think they have been mislabeled, and they should not be sort of grouped as this violent sort of group. They should be, they are, I'm trying to think of some words to say.
Yeah.
So I feel they have been mislabeled, and I feel these people are the ones who are trying to do it the most. And I feel, like Alex said, that these protests should be more well organised and have more people to really get through to the government and not have so much disruption, but to really take a stance and prove and get our voices heard.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to stick with you for the final question, which is from Joe, which is, how active do you feel your school is in terms of how it uses energy and resources? How well does your school manage the use of energy and resources, given that we are talking about these issues? And we'll start with you, Wallingford School.
So I think our school is very accepting and welcoming to new ideas to tackle climate change. And I think so there's a new development in the school is currently the new buildings, which are, I think, are very energy efficient, and so quite so good in that regard. And another thing that we were potentially looking into was whether or not we could install solar panels onto the roof. I'm not sure. We may not be able to do that, but that's something we're looking into at the moment. Let's hopefully, we'll see how that goes in the future.
There's a lot of encouragement, especially from sixth form, to start making the school a more greener, more environmentally friendly place. And yeah,
I think there's been several kind of quite small developments in our school. Like our canteen recently switched to biodegradable containers and trying to have better food. So I think there's been we've been gradually trying to ramp up our environmental friendliness.
Great. Thank you very much. Brianus?
I think as a whole, our school is quite an old building in general, so it's a little hard to restructure everything with installation and the like. But recently, in the past 2 or 3 years, particularly while I've been at the school, I've seen a lot of progress done towards being more energy efficient and using our resources well. I think in particular, we've got a green flag from the, what's it called?
Bioregional.
The bioregional, that's it, bioregional, which we put some effort towards and we put in plans and projects. And even more recently, we've signed up to a One Planet Living, which is basically a system where you can sign up and you get plans, and it helps you structure ways that you can help your school and sort of fix any problems that you might have. We've been doing that with DGS, as we're part of their Ridgeway Education Trust system.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Didcot girls.
So the school installed solar panels years ago now, even before we were here. So those have been going on for a while, and we are currently trying to negotiate getting new waste disposal contracts to get it so that less of our waste is going to landfill and it's being disposed of more responsibly. And we are also looking to change the cutlery in the containers in the cafeteria to make it so that they are either compostable or recyclable, because the current ones aren't. And we're also making a considerable effort to rewild areas of the sports field and other areas around school that aren't used very much, and so we can use them as wild spaces to encourage wildlife on site.
Great. Well, guys, thank you so much. Another great set of school presentations, and I can see from all the questions that you've really impressed the people who are attending this session here today. So you put a lot of thought into your presentations. I'm very grateful to all of you. I agree with a lot of what you say, and I know that a lot of people watching do as well. So thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to coming into the school again soon. Thanks. Right, well, we are nearly at the end of this session. There's just one final thing. I was asked by an organisation called 0 Hour Oxfordshire to allow them to say something for 5 minutes, which I'm going to do now. So Simon Aldridge has just joined. So he will speak for 5 minutes, and then I will wrap up. Simon, welcome, and over to you.
Good afternoon, David, and thank you for a really valuable discussion. Fantastic to hear from those incredibly articulate young people who are rightly holding us to account. The UN's climate experts, the IPCC, have told us that we need rapid, far-reaching and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society. Prince Charles has rightly talked about putting ourselves on a wartime footing. On climate, we know it's vitally important to keep warming to 1.5 degrees, and nature on which we depend for our food, water, and general well-being is crying out for our help. Now, the UK has done more than most nations with world-leading pledges and targets, as Alok explained, but we're treading water a bit now, and there are signs that we're heading in the wrong direction. Emissions grew by almost 5% last year in the UK. And the science tells us that our current targets, though indeed legally binding, aren't ambitious enough, with the UK's expected carbon footprint, including emissions from goods that we have made abroad, expected to be at least twice what it should be if we want to keep to 1.5 degrees. Now, this isn't about finger pointing. The climate and nature crisis is the biggest challenge that humanity has ever faced. Atmospheric CO2 levels are rising inexorably despite pledges made each year at COP. And where CO2 goes, temperatures follow. No government anywhere is yet doing anywhere near enough. So what I'm interested in is how we break out of this cycle of ever-increasing emissions. As the former CEO of a manufacturing company, I know that to get results, it's essential to have a clear mission statement. Now, of course, we have our net zero by 2050 target, which we led the world with, but it's not so much when we reach net zero that matters. It's the path we take, because CO2 stays in the atmosphere for a long time. It's the total amount we emit up to 2050 that drives temperature, or for mathematicians, the area under the curve. So you can see on this side here, this is the sort of pathway that the IPCC are recommending with rapid cuts now. But in the UK, and this is the sort of pathway we're on. Other countries are actually still increasing, so we're doing better. But the area under that curve is about twice as much, and so emissions too high. On nature, we've seen a worrying decline. England was recently ranked as the 7th most nature-depleted country in the world by the RSPB. Now, it's great that we've signed up to the global goal for nature, and who wouldn't want the lovely recovery in nature abundance that you can see sort of being animated here. But domestically, so far, we've made progress, but we're only so far halting the decline. So I'm excited to be given the chance to talk about the Climate and Ecology Bill, which will provide a clear mission statement, an overarching, legally binding framework to ensure that policy and action are driven by the science and we tackle the climate and nature crises together. The challenge that lies ahead of us is immense, but it's also a huge opportunity for the UK to establish itself as a leader and benefit from a wave of investment in green technology. Now, some people say, what about the cost of living crisis? What Ukraine? How can we afford the changes needed when we've just been hit with COVID? We've got all these other priorities. But as luck would have it, the solutions to all these problems are aligned. Chris Stark told us last year that decarbonising will cost only 1% of GDP, and then it will deliver big savings. This year, with soaring oil prices, the relative cost is even less. In fact, it's now expected, according to the Climate Change Committee, to be negative. So cheaper to transition than continue as we are. Insulating our homes and converting them to clean heat pumps is a great way to tackle fuel poverty and boost disposable income. If we're bold and invest to get ahead of this crisis, we can dramatically cut the energy we waste and make a huge difference to people suffering financial hardship, not just for 1 year, but permanently. Jobs, the labour market's very tight right now, but that won't continue as inflation bites. So a Marshall Plan style green transition will come at just the right time to head off mass unemployment. Stopping burning fossil fuels and protecting nature will also clean our air, ending the census tragedy of 28 to 36,000 UK deaths every year, according to Public Health England, from air pollution, and giving much needed relief to our overburdened NHS. Reducing transport emissions will mean making public transport cheaper and more frequent to persuade people to switch. Germany right now are offering a monthly travel anywhere pass for just €9. Brilliant way to stick it to Putin. And yes, this means costly government support, but we're talking about national security here, and the amounts pale into insignificance when compared to the cost of war. Taking real action will require bold, forward-thinking government. We'll need to support the very many who can't afford it. Italy, for example, are paying 110% of the cost to insulate your home and convert to a heat pump, up to €100,000. Now that's a lot, but it's actually worth it. There's a payback at a macro level. It gives supply chains a boost and will make us better off as a country. And it's not all about government support. There's a huge amount of private capital desperate to move out of 20th century investments and into something more ethical and long-lasting, assets that won't become stranded. But business has been burned too many times with false dawns, initiatives funded for a few years that go on to fail. So if we make the solemn legal commitment represented by the Climate and Ecology Bill, that will send an incredibly powerful message to the business community. It will create the confidence that we need to bring investment capital in. And it won't stop there. The UK is still COP president until we hand over to Egypt this November. Now, we can't tell other countries what to do, but we still have a lot of respect in the world, and we can lead by example. Just like the Climate Change Act of 2008, which our team worked on in the early stages, well, all the way through, and the net zero by 2050 target, UK can lead and others will follow. So the Climate and Ecology Bill could become a model for other developed nations around the world. And wouldn't it be fitting for the country that sparked the Industrial Revolution to lead the way to a healthy, brighter future? I for one, would be incredibly proud to see Britain set a gold standard with the Climate and Ecology Bill. So just to wrap up, what we're asking is for Oxfordshire businesses, schools, councils, parish councils to sign up to our open letter expressing their support for the bill. It's really important for constituent organisations and councils to demonstrate to our MPs that we're ready for this change. So you can see the web address up here to sign up at, and thank you very much for listening. Thank you, David.
Thank you very much, Simon. Well, that concludes this year's Climate Summit. I hope you've enjoyed it and learned some new things, as well as some things that you already knew. I'll be running another one next year. I've tried this year to do different sessions to the ones that I did in the pre-COP summit last year, and I will try to do that again next year. I'll continue my work on the local electricity bill and on trying to get homes built to the latest environmental standards. And as ever, you should contact me as and when you have ideas or concerns that you want to raise. But thank you to everybody who's given up time to speak at this event today, including the schools who I particularly enjoyed listening to. And thank you to all of you attending. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.